Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and indeed good morning or otherwise to all tuned in from different areas, different time zones, either as attendees or speakers for this afternoon's webinar from INUI Galway, Sources and Voices, Archives, Writing and the Irish Diaspora. My name is Dr. Barry Houlihan, archivist at INUI Galway Library. And I'm very glad, along with our great colleagues and co-hosts at the Moore Institute for Research in the Humanities and Social Sciences here at INUI Galway, to be bringing you this webinar this afternoon. And the roots of this event go back some time and was originally intended, as all things were once upon a time, to be an in-person event here in Galway, of course, prior to March 2020 and pre-pandemic. But that period of time may have played to advantage to certain ways. It not only enabled us to be part of a more inclusive event today with speakers based outside of Ireland and to join us from the US and join in indeed from places elsewhere. But also a number of projects, a number of research undertakings that were ongoing at that time have now reached fruition and have become really excellent published works and published projects and completed projects in their own right. So indeed, there was perhaps more to talk about today. So involving that, who will be part of that first panel, our speakers will be brought on board shortly. I'll introduce all of them individually. Our second project will talk about the Kirby Miller Archive of Diaspora Letters, which will be an archive project ongoing here at INUI Galway. So today's webinar brings all of these key people, key projects together to uncover not just new histories, but also importantly, bringing together a number of disciplinary backgrounds from history to literary studies and archives. But more of all that very soon. First of all, to say a few words of welcome to today's webinar, I'm very glad to introduce John Cox, University Librarian here at INUI Galway. So I can pass over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Máire, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to say a few words of introduction and to welcome you all to this seminar, which is once again a great opportunity for the library to collaborate with our colleagues in the Moore Institute. We share with them not only a building on this campus, but also many points of common interest, linked in particular to our archives and special collections. And the archives are of huge importance to us at INUI Galway. We've experienced a period of tremendous growth in the past decade or so. Some very important collections have come in our way, including the Abbey and Gate Theatre digital archives, former Irish President Mary Robinson's papers, and most recently the extensive correspondence by Irish emigrants in the Kirby Miller collection. We take great pride in opening up access to our collections as key sources for teaching and research in any subject area, including the experience and representation of the Irish diaspora, which I know is the theme of today's seminar. The programme shows a great lineup of speakers and panellists across multiple disciplines, and Barry's advised me that many of today's speakers in the first half of the seminar have used the library's archives and special collections in their own projects and publications, and I understand that some of you were able to visit us and others interacted with our staff virtually due to COVID. So it's great that you're willing to join us online today, and thank you very much for that. Our panelists in the second half of the seminar are familiar faces at INUI Galway, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of working very closely with all of them in securing the Kirby Miller archive for this institution. It's been a great cross-campus partnership between the library, the Moore Institute, and Octodufna Huscally to Gaelga. So a huge welcome to all of you joining us today. I hope you'll enjoy the seminar to the full. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, John, for those words of welcome. So by way of a very brief context to today's event, and as I mentioned, I was following with great interest the ongoing research by a number of scholars and a number of projects that were ongoing, some of which engaged with us here directly at INUI Galway and others working with archives elsewhere around the world, and seeing the fruits of all that labour coming to fruition, not just about the experiences of a global Irish diaspora and the archival memory of that global Irish diaspora, but for today's work at least, or for today's webinar, a specific theme to look at Irish America and again the projects that have emanated from that work, from a range of a number of disciplinary backgrounds, all forging new patterns through an international and indeed a transnational archival record and memory of the Irish abroad. So a number of critical themes will come out between today's speakers. For instance, about the consideration and perhaps reconsideration of the role of the Irish language as a medium through which writings and prose, letters, pamphlets, newspapers, literature, and otherwise have circulated and been read and also translated between diaspora communities. The political context to the Irish American diaspora, the experiences, the connections, and again, the political networks around those people who've migrated between Ireland and the US. So again, the representation of Irish American voices and characters in literature is another means of documentation through cultural representation in novels, stories, plays, and otherwise, is another means through which the experiences of the diaspora becomes collected and indeed reanimated. So with all that in mind, our first panel which I'm now delighted to introduce and chair, brings together a number of all these teams together. Our first speaker, which I'll now introduce, is Dr. Beth O'Leary Anish. Beth is Professor of English at Community College of Rhode Island. Her recent book, Irish American Fiction, From World War II to JFK, Anxiety, Assimilation and Activism. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2021. She successfully defended her dissertation entitled Writing Irish America, Communal Memory and the Narrative of Nation in Diaspora at the University of Rhode Island in 2017. Beth has also published in the New Hibernia Review Journal and is active in the American Conference of Irish Studies, for which she is currently president of the New England region. And Beth's paper today is entitled Irish American Fiction in the Post-World War II Years, Representations of a Community in Transition. So Beth, while you're turning on your camera and unmuting, just two pieces of housekeeping is that I might ask all attendees and indeed all panelists to keep their cameras off and on mute while our speakers are presenting. The chat is disabled for attendees, but please put your questions to the Q&A box and I will distribute those to all our speakers at the end of our panel. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly for joining in discussions online, is a hashtag for today's event, which I'll pop perhaps in the Q&A so people can see that, which is hashtag Diaspora Archives. So now that those housekeeping events or housekeeping notices are over, I'll pass over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Barry, and to NUI Galway and Moore Institute for having me here today and inviting me to share a little bit about my work on Irish American fiction in the post-World War II years. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint to the screen and kick things off. Second. Okay, so again, thanks very much everyone for being here. This is a little bit about my recently published work that Barry mentioned, Irish American Fiction from World War II to JFK, and I'm really looking at the fiction of Irish America during that period, mining it for evidence of transitions in Irish American identity and in the Irish American community. This research started when I was in my PhD program at URI. The dissertation itself was a much broader work and focused on a longer time period from the 1940s into the early 2000s. But when I went back to look at it to see what of this I thought I wanted to publish, I knew I wanted to publish something of it. I just kept coming back to this post-World War II time period. It was surprising to me as I did that I was really looking at the era that my parents came of age. They both graduated from high school in the early 1940s. And a lot of the themes and concerns, especially that come up in the fiction of that time, were things that I realized formed them and therefore formed me. And so their generation was a turning point in Irish America that we'll talk about. The book brings together, as I say here, 6 Irish American novelists plus one novelist who is thought to be Irish American. She isn't, but the book is considered a hallmark of Irish American literature. And there's more to talk about that. Most of these novels are relatively obscure, long out of print. Only a couple of them have gained much critical attention or lasting popularity. So I think it's an opportunity to bring some of these wonderful works back into the public eye and hopefully for more critical study. So this book exists in 3 time periods, really. It's the time period of the author's childhoods. They're fiction, but they certainly draw on their life and the neighborhoods that they knew growing up, which were, for the most part, neighborhoods in the American Northeast that were urban, concentrated ethnic neighborhoods with a strong Irish identity to them, and most often built up around a Catholic parish. but they're writing at a time of transition. So they experience that kind of neighborhood as children. But then by the time they're writing as adults, they're looking back on this, what was once, a community of immigrants is now mostly, if it's still an Irish American community, it's by choice, it's by ethnic identity, which is more a chosen thing a few generations in. We'll talk about why. And then I'm writing the book, or I was writing the book in the past several years as Donald Trump came to power in the United States, and the rise of ethnocentric rhetoric, anti-Semitic and racist attacks. Not that things like that had ever completely gone away, but this seems to be a resurgence in the US as in many places in the world. So I'm looking at these books through the lens of my current time as well. Just a quick few stats that many of you may already know, and these are, as I mentioned at the bottom here, are borrowed from Kevin Kenny's The American Irish History. So with thanks to him for this. In just to set the context of how America, or Irish America, was changing in the 1940s, or by the 1940s. You had around the time that these authors were born, which was, most of them were born around just before 1910 or just after, a few years on either side of that. So around the time they were born, in 1900, 5 million first and second generation Irish, so Irish immigrants and their children, were on the census in the United States, and that exceeded the population of Ireland by more than 500,000. Pretty startling stat when we think about diaspora and how many Irish folks were here in the US at that time. But things slowed way down to a trickle after the 1920s. A couple of immigration acts restricted the flow of immigrants from Ireland to the US. The Great Depression obviously stopped people coming here for work, since there was no work to be had. World War II, tough time to travel. And so you see the drop off of Irish immigration, which in the US in the 1920s had been about 220,000, dropped by the 30s to 13,000, and then only rebounded just a tiny bit in the 1940s to 26, almost 27,000. This means that the Irish American community by the 1940s, and certainly after, while there were always new Irish immigrants, the communities themselves were now third, fourth generation Irish. They were not the immigrant communities that they once were. And then the other factor in the changing of Irish America at that time is the GI Bill, which was a bill for returning soldiers from World War II, encouraged soldiers or returning soldiers, I should say, and many families to get an education, to move up and out of the urban neighborhoods they had once been in. And in fact, they were also offered housing incentives to build what was turning into our suburbs at the time. So to get to the literature I cover in this book, there's a wonderful essay you may have read by John B. Kelleher, Harvard professor of Celtic Studies. He wrote this essay, Irish American Literature and Why There Isn't Any, in 1947. Kelleher was a great Irish American thinker, native of Lawrence, Mass., which was a working class former mill town, and saw that his neighborhood and neighborhoods like that were disappearing by the time he was writing this essay. He complained that no one had yet captured the full story in fiction of the Irish American story. So it's right around this time, seemingly with similar concerns, that starting in 1946, 47, 48, a lot of these novels that I'm talking about were written and published. And they seem to be an attempt to capture what these communities had been like at the time of their childhoods. through a heavy dose of nostalgia. We'll just keep that in mind as well. And I'll talk last about Edwin OConnor, who was a great friend of John Kelleher, who may have come closest to realizing Kelleher's dream here of creating an actual Irish American literature. So some of the themes I saw across these works, which I'll introduce to you in just a moment, read collectively, they evidence an anxiousness of what was being lost as Irish Americans became just Americans, assimilated to American culture. Just after World War II, another theme, or something you see quite often in these books, anti-Semitic incidents and the response to them from Irish American characters. Sometimes they are perpetrated by Irish American characters. So the horrors of the Holocaust certainly on the minds of the authors as they're writing. These novelists wish to reclaim, it seems, an Irish heritage as generous, welcoming, anti-oppression, and pro-immigrants. And again, I mentioned, you know, certainly some nostalgia here, and certainly some, there could be some revisionist history happening in fiction to write the Irish American neighborhood as this, in one of the books actually makes it an Eden, basically, of kind of a pure place to be before other influences come in, most notably capitalism. So they're writing fiction to heal what they saw as broken in their community. And these novels also serve to remind us, again, using that lens of my time period as one of the time periods of the book I wrote, that conservative and progressive strands have long existed in Irish America. So some of the tensions covered in these books, or some of the tensions revealed, I should say, in these books, are the conflict over whether to support labor activism and working people or capitalism and business owners. So we know that Irish Americans were heavily involved in the labor movement in the United States, but then there were also folks who were looking to shut that down and to label anyone involved as radical, as communist, and therefore, you know, outcasts in the community. Another big question being pondered by some of these novelists is, would the Catholic Church be a church for the poor and working people, or for the middle class and wealthy? So that creates some tension in the books. Not surprisingly, those who had gained some property and some prosperity in the US, as the Irish had at this point in America, want to hang on to that. And unfortunately, fear over losing that property and that prosperity can turn to bigotry against newcomers or anybody perceived to be a lower rung on the socioeconomic ladder. This was probably the most fun trend I found in these books. Irish American elders, usually a grandfather, sometimes an uncle or a father. I'd need more exploration into why they were so infrequently women. There's at least one very strong mother figure, but most of these elders depicted in the way I'm going to describe here were men. So in most of the novels, an elder or grandfather especially stands on the side of the oppressed and against bigotry. He often reminds the younger characters in his charge about the values that he came to the country with, especially reminding them of the fact that he came here poor and oppressed, and that, you know, reminding them not to turn against people in the same kinds of situations that the Irish arrived in the US. I think it's important that this generation, especially the grandparent generation, is dying out in these books. Again, these authors are reflecting back to their childhoods. The protagonists are most often children, and the children who would be about the same age as the authors. And the grandfathers are, well, without giving too much away, they don't often make it to the end of the novel, sadly, but they are there to remind their grandchildren of what it means to be aligned with other people who are oppressed, and what it means to be generous to all those in need, and so on. The novelists, taken collectively, again, as I do in the book, they seem to represent this as a brand of Irishness in danger of being forgotten in the US. And these books seem to serve as a reminder of what they think the Irish in America, or Irish America, should be. I'm going to quickly buzz through the literature in this short time period. I can't get in depth in any of these, but that's what the book is for, I suppose. So A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, very quickly. This is the book by Betty Smith. And this is the one when I said to people, hey, I'm writing about Irish American fiction. They said, oh, have you read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn? Betty Smith actually wasn't Irish American, and I'm not holding that against her. Some of the depictions of Irish Americans, though, in my mind, are a little one-dimensional and often rely on stereotypes, especially the drunken father. And for my money, the Austrian grandparents, which are Betty Smith's in real life, her grandparents, her parents, in fact, were Austrian immigrants, are much more fully realized characters. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, because I want to get to the ones that do show all the trends that I talked about. And Edward McSorley's Our Own Kind, which is set in Providence, Rhode Island. Most of these are very regional, very specific to a neighborhood. Does have that strong grandfather character. He was the first one I saw. His name is Ned McDermott, and just saw the pattern of this Irish immigrant grandfather, laborer, working man, who's so concerned about his grandson, Willie, the protagonist of the novel, both becoming a respected, literate American, educated, but also remembering a sense of who he is as an Irish person, and the conflict of how Willie can retain or gain both is the conflict of the novel. Harry Sylvester, this is one, speaking of archival research, Harry Sylvester's papers are at the Georgetown University Library, and I was able to spend a couple of days there going through all his papers. He's a fascinating guy, somewhat angry, and that might be downplaying it a little bit, but Moon Gaffney is really a takedown of the Irish American hierarchy of the Catholic Church in New York, and I would say in the US at this time, and really question the values of priests and bishops who might be trying to fill their coffers instead of helping the poor. And I'll just, again, cruise through some of these in the interest of time, but they're all fascinating, and I hope you look up these books eventually. Mary Doyle Kahn is from just an hour from down the Massachusetts Turnpike from where I am right now in Worcester, Mass. She's from Holyoke, which is a big Carey Irish community in real life, and she grew up there, and she set this book, The Parish there, and she is concerned about folks who are social climbing and pretentious, and forgetting, again, their roots as working class people and as Irish people. Another great, strong grandfather character in this, and so is the mother. This is the one female, strong female elder as well, Máire O'Connor, is a great role model to her daughter, but so many of the other Irish Americans around them are just more concerned with looks and what the neighbors might think and that kind of thing. Again, very quickly, Ellen Berlin. She wrote a few novels, but one of them is called Lace Curtain, where she explores the very upper class set. Ellen Berlin was born Ellen Mackey. She was an heiress to a silver fortune of her grandfather, who was an Irish immigrant, John Mackey. And she wrote about the Irish, even though they were extremely wealthy in the case of her family and the family in this novel, still not being accepted into the upper levels of American society, the highest levels, because they were considered the servant class, no matter the mansion they owned or the money they had. Ellen Berlin is, interestingly, also married to Irving Berlin, and there's a whole story behind that that I'd love to share with you over coffee or a pint at some point. John Steinbeck, of course, a famous American novelist, not often considered an Irish American novelist, but his maternal grandparents were both from Ireland. And in East of Eden, he fictionalizes his grandfather, Samuel Hamilton, and his experience becoming an American and raising a family in America as a subplot of East of Eden. I had to read this book when I read about Steinbeck and his journey back to Ireland, to Derry, to explore his grandfather's roots. And again, the strong grandfather character comes through. It fit with all the other stuff I was writing. So that was perfect. And last but not least, and finally, Edwin OConnor, who writes, he doesn't call it Boston, but it certainly looks like Boston. A great story of The Last Hurrah probably does what John Kelleher had hoped, which is covers through the stories of its Frank Skeffington, this mayor on his last mayoral campaign in Boston. He's teaching his nephew all the stories of old time Boston Irish, the immigrant generation and the next generation, and what they all went through. And I will end with that, with so much more I could say, but thank you all for listening. This is a list of the books that I cover in World War II to JFK. I recommend them all to you, and I'd be glad to take questions later. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Beth, for a really great paper. Certainly I know plenty of questions I'm sure will come later on, and we'll hold all those questions just until the end. So great, thanks you again, Beth. And just to move on to our next speaker. Next speaker is on Dr. Pádraig Fia O'Mahuna. He's a researcher on the Fionn Folklore Project at Harvard University and a visiting fellow in Irish Studies at Queen's University, Belfast. He is the editor, excuse me, he's the editor and translator of the recent book, Recovering an Irish Voice from the American Frontier, the prose writings of Eoin O'Connell, which is based on research carried out while Pádraig was a Fulbright scholar here at NUI Galway Library. And it was a great pleasure to have Pádraig here as a researcher, as a Fulbright fellow, and I get to see so much of their work in progress. So a very warm welcome back, albeit virtually, to NUIG today. And Pádraig's paper title is The Writings of Eoin O'Connell, Gaelic Revivalist and American Frontiersman. So I'll pass over to you.
Okay, so thanks for that, Barry, and thanks for the invite to appear on the panel today. And as you say, I was in the archive for a year on a Fulbright, so thanks for the many great chats and cups of tea during that period as well. And it's great to see so many friends and colleagues' names on the, I suppose, in attendance today. So thank you all for coming as well. So I'll just speak briefly about a recent diaspora-related project that I undertook, as Barry mentioned, which utilized the special collections housed in NUIG, as well as materials in the National Library, the UCD National Folklore Collection, and other archives over in the US. And I think it really gels well with Beth's really fascinating research that she just gave us a snapshot of there, as well as that of Máire and Sophie, which is yet to come. So the project, as Barry mentioned, ultimately resulted in the bilingual volume of translations, Recovering an Irish Voice from the American Frontier, which is comprised of 14 semi-autobiographical stories and a number of letters written by an emigrant from County Limerick named Eoin O'Connell, who settled in the American West during the mid to late 1860s. And he landed in the country in 1863 at the age of 23. So I suppose anybody that knows even a bit about American history, we know that's a quite heightened time of the American Civil War. We have the Battle of Gettysburg that summer, and the kind of infamous New York City draft riots as well in the summer heat of that year, right before Eoin lands into the country. So working After working briefly for the military in the Quartermaster General's Department, supplying troops and barracks with what they needed during the war effort, OConnell relocated to the upper Midwest, where he lived a fairly regular existence until his death in 1928, working at various times as a pub owner, a barber, farmer, timber surveyor, and for a brief period during the 1870s as a Chicago police officer. But it's in his kind of Western writings that Eoin O'Connell transforms himself into a Western hero, very much in the style of Buffalo Bill Cody or Kit Carson. So in my limited time this afternoon, I'll just speak a little bit about a few of the source materials I used to paint a picture of his life and his kind of writing persona, amongst which were private letters, and we see some of these here, and reflections, official state and military records, folklore accounts, family papers, periodicals, as well as, of course, the unpublished manuscripts of his Western tales, which are housed within the Hyde papers, as I mentioned in NUIG, but also in the National Library. So just on that point, I suppose it was important because there's two copies of each of the stories, one in Dublin and one in Galway. So I really had to have a close reading of the text and kind of collate even the most minute details to see, if there was any discrepancies within these writings or these different versions of the writings. So when talking about sourcing Irish America, I suppose it's important to note that an understanding of Irish, given that so many post-famine Irish immigrants were Irish speakers, native Irish speakers, and more so an understanding of the literary practices in Irish at the time, is essential to appreciating the limitations of so much official and archival source materials, and underscores why O'Connell's Irish language texts are so crucial as a reflection of this fact and a reflection of kind of the multilingual or bilingual Irish America. And on this point, I'll just focus on one instance where it was very clear that Eoin O'Connell was engaging with an aspect of wider American popular culture through a bicultural and inherently bilingual lens, that being the social memory of the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the avenging Custer motif, which became such a staple of Western entertainment and culture in the months and years after the battle itself in the summer of 1876. So just to offer a bit of kind of background context for Eoin O'Connell's writings, between 1913 and 1927, O'Connell sent these manuscripts of his frontier stories, written entirely in Irish, to the Gaelic League founder and later first president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, with the intent of having them published in Ireland. Ultimately, that never came to fruition, unfortunately. The nature of he and Hyde's relationship, we can say, is somewhat ambiguous. It doesn't appear that they met during Hyde's well-publicized tour of the US, which Máire will speak on about here soon. Instead, O'Connell indicated that a Chicago-based priest, who I think actually features in Máire's translated text of Hyde's writings of his Tuairisc America, Father Owen O'Carroll, initially put the two in contact, and they maintained a correspondence until O'Connell's death in 1928. And a few of these private letters that they exchanged are now housed in the special collections at NUIG, and we can see one here in kind of the foreground of the slide. So the stories themselves, just to touch on them, they deliver purported firsthand accounts of O'Connell's lives on the plains and in the forests of the upper Midwest, detailing everything from conflicts with Native Americans and an encounter with a runaway slave to bear attacks, wolf attacks, and cabin building. Throughout, O'Connell provides paratexts, assuring the reader of their authenticity. And just a side note, I suppose this is a common feature amongst writers of the American West at the time, like Buffalo Bill Cody or Ned Buntline, I suppose, who wrote the Buffalo Bill stories, who seamlessly blended the mythic and the mundane in their personal accounts, or what they said were their personal accounts. So in every sense, we can say that O'Connell's stories mark a really significant attempt or a significant moment in Irish language literature as he's attempting to adapt the American dime novel genre to the Irish language for the first time. So reflecting this importance, I suppose we can say that O'Connell has either been the subject of or featured to varying degrees in a number of previous scholarly works, including two wonderful MA and PhD theses by Niamh Brannock and Nancy Walczyk, and works by the late Alf McLaughlin and Kenneth Nielsen, as well as Kirby Miller, who we'll be speaking about later today, as well as Philip O'Leary, and most recently, Pádraig Ó Séal. In some instances, he's pointed to for expressing the views of a typical Irish-speaking immigrant in his letters. But elsewhere, and more commonly, scholars have focused on his autobiographical stories and questioned where the line between fact and fiction lies there within. So fortunately for me, during the course of the project, as I grappled with this same question of where this line of fact and fiction kind of came about, my prayers were answered quite literally when I one Saturday afternoon, I sent a message on a whim to the local parish Facebook page in Owen O'Connell's native area of West Limerick, seeing if they might be able to offer any insight into the family or any surviving members of the family. And within about 2 hours, I was in contact with a direct descendant who is a fount of knowledge about Owen O'Connell, and also sent me on to her kind of distant relation, Owen's granddaughter from a later marriage who lived in California. And she actually had a lot of private family papers, a considerable amount, and some of his own literature that he had collected and that he had written. Kind of, there was a lot of marginalia there. And she gave me access to all of these materials as well. So this really transformed the project. This allowed me insight into the actual realities of Owen's life, as opposed to the character that he writes about in his book, and into his family background and his literary and political interests, both in the Irish context and in the US context. And it was actually through a letter that was written to his niece, who was a famous actress, Florence Johns, over in the US, that I was able to single out an unattributed quote, which I initially thought was Karl Marx, but lo and behold, it was a quote about religion, kind of a skepticism about religion. And I traced it back to a popular adventure writer and biographer of many Western figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, named James W. Buell. And this revealed a number of apparent borrowings from O'Connell, or by O'Connell, for the Western experiences that he describes as his own experiences from Buell's description of Buffalo Bill Cody. So he was taking these plots from Buffalo Bill stories and kind of putting himself in and Gaelicizing them for an Irish audience. So one of the quintessential events, as I mentioned earlier, described within Buell's work is the Battle of the Little Bighorn, during which George Armstrong Custer was killed along 261 of his cavalrymen by a coalition from the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, after attacking a large native village along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana in the Black Hills on June 25th, 1876. So news of the event spread like wildfire in the days and months after the battle, and the story of Custer's last stand soon entered American mythology. One of the main precipitants of this kind of shift from reality into the mythic was actually Buffalo Bill Cody, a well-known stage hero and frontiersman who by that stage had taken a break from his brand of Western entertainment to go out west and scout for the army again. So not long after he learned of Custer's demise, he was involved in a skirmish with a Cheyenne war party, and dressed in a black velvet stage costume, he killed and scalped a Cheyenne sub-chief named Yellow Hair. And within months, he returned back east, and he was performing or reenacting this episode of taking his first scalp for Custer to packed houses from New York all the way out to St. Louis. So that's one kind of episode that launches this mystique around Custer into the popular imagination or social memory of the United States. The other is actually that kind of cemented this image into the minds of many Americans, was actually a lithograph, this lithograph, entitled Custer's Last Fight, which, as we see here, was commissioned by the St. Louis-based beer company Anheuser-Busch, famous for Budweiser. Now, what they did was, I suppose, they printed 150,000 copies of this exact lithograph and sent it out to pubs and taverns and saloons all across the US in 1896, exactly 20 years after the battle. So this is kind of the enduring image that a lot of Americans had of this kind of last stand motif, which wasn't actually the case right after the battle. This emerges, as is often the case, within the social memory after the fact. So significantly, the influence of this cultural trend and the prevalence of images like this is evident in O'Connell's writings. However, it's important to note that it is also included within the well-known memoir of Mickey McGowan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Rowamore and Teal, which tracks his journey across America to the Klondike around the turn of the 20th century. So right around the time this lithograph was going into pubs and taverns. And as he later recalled in Rowamore and Teal, which was actually collected, it wasn't written as a standard text, but it was dictated to his son-in-law, the well-known folklorist Sean Hoare, who then later had it published. And he says, Tríd na céad cá idir an far bán agus an far Jerrick sa tír seo a bhí hart orinne, agus ba bhíle vinnic a hula mé scéalte faoi Custer's Last Stand agus faoin cogu uig a bhí an leis an sú turmer hihid bli an river seo. So hundreds of battles were fought between the white men and the red men in the countryside around us. And it was very often that I heard stories about Custer's Last Stand and the entire war which had occurred with the Sioux around 20 years ago. So it's, I suppose, O'Connell's inclusion of this well-known event is more intriguing maybe than McGowan's, as his wasn't an entirely passive recollection of just hearing stories about it. Instead, he wrote a poem in the style of an oceanic, I suppose he wrote it in oceanic verse, in which he places himself in the motif made popular by Cody and other dime novelists in the immediate aftermath of the battle, as part of the force sent to avenge the well-known general's death. So we see here, I suppose, an image of O'Connell, and I'll get to the other image in a moment, but one Chicago newspaper, which was sent a copy of this unpublished poem, took the story at face value, noting, quote, Mr. O'Connell served in the United States Cavalry and was a member of the expedition sent out to avenge the massacre of General Custer and his command in the mountains of the Little Bighorn. Showing the significance, and here we see in this image, an adaptability of the language in O'Connell's work. He even Gaelicized the event as quite literally on Arch Beag Mór, and included it with a description in this kind of dictionary of terms that he set out for his intended readership back in Ireland. And I've included this dictionary in the collection Recovering an Irish Voice as well, for his prospective readers. So this inclusion marked a significant point, I suppose, in my own research of trying to decipher this fact and fiction between O'Connell's life and his writings, as the cross-referencing of source materials from O'Connell's brief military career and his civilian life showed that at the time of the battle during the summer of 1876, rather than riding out after the native tribes in the Black Hills, he was actually working as a Chicago policeman. And he would actually have to resign that post as a result of illness. And then he opened a pub back in Michigan, which he operated for the next 20 years. So there's a good chance, being in the Midwest as well, that he would have gotten one of those Anheuser-Busch lithographs, though we can't say that definitively. So I'll just conclude by stressing the importance of engaging with Irish language materials. And I suppose the case of Owen O'Connell shows, and he's speaking on topics that aren't Irish at all, but really American and settler colonial kind of outlooks on things like the Little Bighorn. We have to look at Irish language sources even beyond the scope, and especially beyond the scope of the language movement itself and the language revival itself. So this is important in carrying out social histories of Irish America during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the writings of, I suppose, Irish-speaking immigrants, wherever they may appear, whether it's in newspaper columns, and this is a source that Matt Knight and Fiona Lyons have done brilliant work on recently, diary entries, letters or stories. They're essential to understanding Irish America and its place within the multilingual society of the United States. And within this dynamic, one must, I suppose, consider the silences and the lack of Irish and ask broader questions about hierarchies of language and what history records and what it leaves out. And I suppose in terms of historiography, we often have to ask the question as well, how this is perpetuated by modern scholarship, which itself often tends to be very Anglo-centric. So I'll just add that this is still the case in areas where Irish is found as a living language in the United States, and stress the need to build archives and record the stories and views of those living through their native tongue. The likes of Brendan E. Houlihan, and more recently a team under Brian Frickenberg at Harvard University, have recognized the importance of this fact and interviewed many native Irish speaking residents throughout New England, including in the city where I was born, Hartford, where there is still a number of native Irish speakers. There's a strong kind of Irish language element there, mostly from West Carey, but also from the Aran Islands. And I think that the fruits of their labor will undoubtedly provide a wealth of material for future historians of Irish America as well. So Fágime and Shane, and thanks a million. So I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to Barry.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Really fascinating account of a truly recovered voice and O'Connell's work, and as well as turning up a whole new privately held collection of papers, which must have been amazing. And we might get a chance to talk about that at a Q&A session later on. So to move on to our next speaker, I'm Dr. Máire Nic an Bhaird. And Máire can't be with us live today, but in a truly and typically generous act of support for today's event, Máire has pre-recorded her presentation and sent through the video, which I will play for you now. But just to give a quick introduction for Máire, in any case, so Dr. Máire Nic an Bhaird is a lecturer in Irish language and literature and history of education at the Froebel Department in Maynooth University. Her areas of teaching and research include the life and work of Douglas Hyde, censorship of Irish language literature, 1920 to 1960, children's literature in the Irish language, education for the science, society nexus, and history of education. Máire's teaching is grounded in a pedagogy of community-engaged learning, and Máire has won numerous teaching bursaries and awards for the creation of teaching materials and programs connected with Maynooth University modules that she coordinates. Máire is also leading the university's central role in the UCD-led €2 million Horizon Europe Ed BioEc project. So Máire's title of Máire's presentation today is Douglas Hyde, Ireland and the USA. And I will attempt at least to load her video up now. So if it doesn't play or if people can't hear it, please let it be known. But I will pass over to Máire's presentation now.
Díomh Chordia is Smisha Máire Nic an Bhaird o Ulscoil Bhá Nuad, and I'm delighted to be here with you today, virtually, to present on Douglas Hyde and his trip to America in 1905-1906. And I just wish to thank Dr. Barry Houlihan for all his help and support. There are fabulous sources in the archives in NUIG, which we have used to help us gain a greater insight into this formidable character. So Tullivlee and Mahuna and I have been collaborating for a number of years now on a research project on the life and work of Douglas Hyde, the leading cultural activist of the language revival. It was through Hyde's force of personality and the relatively favourable temper of his time that he was able to bring his concern for the future of the Irish language and its culture to centre stage in the public sphere at the beginning of the 20th century. Douglas Hyde was a lifelong generator, collector and recorder of eco documents and ephemera, letters, diaries, drafts of speeches, newspaper cuttings and photographs. For example, there are 13 diaries of Hyde that he wrote between 1874 and 1912, which are housed in the National Library of Ireland. In this photo here, you can see his first diary that he kept between 1874 and 1876. The newspapers provided a platform for the dissemination of nationalist and revivalist ideals, so their importance as an instrument of change should not be overlooked. In the early 1900s, the news reached the public all in print, and the newspapers were at the height of their power and influence. They were inexpensive. The publishers and editors of the largest daily newspapers of that time had enormous political and social influence. Newspapers carry the news of the world. And journalism is so important to historians because it can give us a window into the past. It can tell us what people were thinking and saying at various important times in the past. It is for this reason that journalism is sometimes called the first draft of history. Hyde, a cultural activist, had an astute appreciation of the importance of publicity and public relations, as did John Quinn, the Irish-American New York lawyer, and you can see John Quinn in this picture here, and Father Peter York, the Irish-born Catholic priest in San Francisco. These two men were the principal organisers of Hyde's 1905-1906 fundraising tour of America for the Gaelic League. John Quinn was born in Ohio in 1870, the oldest son of Irish immigrants. His mother was from Cork, his father from County Limerick. From an early age, Quinn was fascinated by literature. Moving to New York after taking degrees at both Georgetown University and Harvard, Quinn quickly established himself as an accomplished and affluent lawyer. Douglas Hyde, his book Mahurisca America, My American Journey, is dedicated to John Quinn, and this highlights how Hyde wished to bestow a very high honour on him and to praise him for his work as chief organiser of Hyde's American tour. The fact that his biography, Mahurisca America, was dedicated to John Quinn shows us the importance of John Quinn to the whole operation. Father Peter Christopher York was an Irish-American Catholic priest and a noted Irish Republican and Labour activist in San Francisco. He was actually born in Galway, but then he moved to America. So he was born in Galway, studied in Cloiste Ignoids in Galway, then moved to St. Jarlath's in Tuam, then went on to St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, and then to the Archdiocese of San Francisco. In San Francisco, he became the editor of The Monitor, the official newspaper of the Archdiocese. In 1902, he founded and edited a local San Francisco newspaper called The Leader. Every Palm Sunday, the United Irish Societies of San Francisco hold a memorial celebration of Father York at Holy Cross Cemetery. Douglas Hyde, president of the Gaelic League, left Ratra in County Roscommon, Ireland on the 6th of November 1905 as he and his wife Lucy Comatina Kurtz set off on his lecture trip to America to promote the Gaelic League. Hyde was 46 years of age. He went to the Gresham Hotel on O'Connell Street, then known as Sackville Street, at 7:15 p.m. Then that evening there was a giant torchlit procession planned to bid farewell to Hyde, and that brought him to Knightsbridge Station, now Houston Station. On the 8th of November, he boarded the SS Majestic in Queenstown, now known as Cove in County Cork, and he landed in New York on the 15th of November 1905, and he returned on the 24th of June 1906 with many stories and memories from his trip. He was 46 years of age, as I've said, and his journey spread right across the States from the eastern seaboard to the western. And here you have a document, again from the National Library of Ireland, and we can see his schedule in November from the 20th of November 1905 and just where he was going until December the 12th, 1905. Hyde's 1904-1907 diary, which is housed in the National Library and is digitised, has Hyde's diary entries from the day he left Ratra until the 1st of January 1906. On the 1st of January, he stops mid-sentence and does not pick up his diary until August 1906. His trip was about fundraising. It was about highlighting the Irish revival. For example, in his diary on the 28th of November 1905, when he is in Connecticut, Hyde writes that he went into the big city and asked the wealthy people for money. He was promised $200 from one man. He concludes that day, as he did many a diary entry with reference to the weather, a very wet day. John Quinn did organise a very tight schedule for Hyde, as you can see in the picture, and he really had a lot of work to do, but John Quinn looked after him. And this is evident in Hyde's diary entry of the 29th of November 1905, where he says that he had a cold and John Quinn would not let him out and brought his dinner to him. So the James Hardiman Library contains an amazing scrapbook of press cuttings of Hyde's American tour from February to June 1906. Mainly from American newspapers and others dealing with Hyde's triumphant return to Ireland. The Galway volume is a testimony to the international public recognition accorded to Hyde as the pioneering leader of the Gaelic revival and its campaign of cultural disruption. This volume, named Volume 2, was prepared by Una ní Ógáin, a Gaelic League colleague of Hyde's. It is assumed that the first volume is either lost or missing, and the National Library of Ireland acquired a similar, if less elaborate, scrapbook for 1903-1904, which Hyde actually compiled himself. It would appear, therefore, that Hyde compiled scrapbooks of his own and of the Gaelic League's activities over the years. And again, I just want to thank Dr. Barry Houlihan for just being so supportive and letting us really examine this wonderful source which is available in his library. Una ní Óconnor, Una Young, was born in 1868. She began collecting religious poetry around 1915. In 1928, she published Dáanta Day Idir Sean is Nua. She had collected the words and the airs and edited this book. And Una dedicated the book to Douglas Hyde. He was her inspiration in regard to the Irish language. However, Una actually did die in 1927. Therefore, it was Hyde himself who ensured that this collection was published. Perhaps Una ní Óconnor collated Volume 2 by way of a gift for Hyde at Christmas. As you can see here, Uncreeving even from his friend, and we have Una ní Óconnor, Nullig 1906. This scrapbook is not in chronological order of the American tour, but it is categorised alphabetically. As you can see on this page, under the letter C, we have places Hyde visited in California. John Quinn worked on increasing Hyde's overall reputation in America. This public relations plan that John Quinn created and implemented was a strategic communication process that helped the success of Hyde's tour. Understanding the target audience is the most important part of any successful public relations strategy, and both John Quinn and Hyde knew their audience. The publicity that Hyde achieved through newspapers at the time helped to heighten the public awareness of Hyde's lecture tour and of his fundraising mission. This was a highly successful marketing campaign, as can be seen through this volume in NUIG. Publicity through the newspapers helped Hyde to get his story out there, helped others to become aware of him and Conradh na Gaeilge. Media played a significant role in keeping everyone updated about his tour and the successes. The most important function of the media is to disseminate news to the masses concerning vital occurrences or important information. And the newspapers did exactly this. And this can be seen through Una's scrapbook, where she kept newspaper reports, lecture pamphlets, which helped showcase the strategic marketing machine that aided the successful tour of America. Throughout this scrapbook, you not only see written text, but you also see sketches of Hyde and photographs too. A picture is a great way to convey your message quickly to an audience without them reading through a lot of text. Printed pictures are incredibly important as they allow us to capture a certain moment in time. This picture here is taken from the News, Toronto, on Friday the 18th, May 1906. We see Douglas Hyde, who is standing tall, looking powerful, and his moustache is the most striking physical feature that always enhances his enigmatic character. The following sentence appears around his figure. None of the good old Irish songs were forgotten, and the title of the piece is Dr. Douglas Hyde, a distinguished Irish orator, addressed a large audience in the Massey Hall last night on the objects of the Gaelic League. We see Hyde's non-partisan attitude which he publicly held and which allowed him to be a very suitable statesman as Ireland's first president in this piece about his speech in Massey Hall, Toronto. Irish orator sings the praises of the Emerald Isle of the Sea and held the sons of Ireland in a trance of enthusiasm. The Gaelic League is a dove of peace, presenting neither clique, faction nor party. Here we see the pamphlet that was used during his lecture in Washington in May 1906. This was not unusual. Most of his lectures had a pamphlet with the order and schedule for the event. Here we see that Hyde spoke in the National Theatre in Washington, D.C. on Sunday evening, May 20th, 1906. We can see from the pamphlet that the Star-Spangled Banner was sung and also God Save Ireland, which is an Irish rebel song celebrating the Manchester martyrs, 3 Fenians executed in 1867. It served as an unofficial Irish national anthem for Irish nationalists from the 1870s to the 1910s. Again, another example from Una's collection is the event which happened 1 week later in Polly's Theatre on Sunday evening in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Here we have a photo of Hyde, which is nearly regal in nature. And all these newspaper cuttings that I'm showing you, unless otherwise stated, they're all from the NUIG collection that Barry has shared with me. Here we have a piece in the publication The Tidings, which was founded in 1895 and is the oldest published Catholic periodical on the west coast of the United States. The title here, Prepare for the Coming of Dr. Hyde, has biblical connotations. It makes you want to read more about the man in the photo, who looks very important, and the light shining on his face illuminates him and highlights to the reader his vast knowledge that he holds and will share at this meeting in Los Angeles. Here we see the Irish World, an American industrial liberator newspaper. Patrick Ford settled in New York City in 1870 and founded the Irish World, which became the principal newspaper of Irish America. It promised more reading material than any other paper in America. We see Douglas Hyde presented as a man of strength, a leader who oozes charisma. He is pictured in various standing positions when orating during his tour. This was published on 10th of March, and during this period he would have been in California. Even the use of the word addressing great audiences in California highlights the impact of his tour and the eagerness of newspapers to help the propaganda machine in order to raise funds for an Irish Ireland. During this period, he would have been delivering his speeches at Tivoli Opera House, Berkeley, Sacramento, California, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles. And we can see here surrounding the figures of Hyde are words from his speeches such as, "The greatest misfortune that ever befell Ireland was the loss of his language. I am here to explain to you the life and death struggle upon which we are now engaged in Ireland." Hyde regularly used the terms life and death struggle when presenting, and this wording would encourage people to give generously. He was very clever and chose his words carefully to ensure an emotive response from the audience and also to ensure drama in the newspapers. This is an example of the speech Hyde gave to the crowd when in Chicago. He uses emotive language and the imagery of the life and death struggle. His natural acting abilities helped in this endeavour to move the masses towards the Irish League and to promote its importance. The speech is found in the National Library Ireland and highlights the phrase which the newspaper used, life and death struggle. I am not exaggerating when I say that I look upon the moral support of the Irish in America to be the most valuable asset that the Gaelic League at home could have. I am here today to explain to you the life and death struggle upon which we are engaged in Ireland. I see that the papers say that this is the last grand struggle of the Irish race to preserve their language. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, it is 10 times, it is 100 times, it is 1,000 times more far-reaching than that. It is the last possible life and death struggle of the Irish race to preserve not their own language, but their national identity. The poem on this slide was delivered to Hyde during his lecture in Oakland on March 1st, 1906. There was a lot of thought and effort put into the welcoming of Hyde, from songs to poetry written about Douglas Hyde. For example, here is a poem written for Douglas Hyde, and I'll just read you out a short stanza. Welcome to Dr. Douglas Hyde. You bring glad news from our old Ireland. News to cheer the exiled soul, you bring glad news from Holy Ireland. You come to preach the restoration of our grand old Celtic tongue. From your mission, home returning, radiant at your great success, take this message brightly burning to our kindred in distress. A big earthquake hit San Francisco in 1906, and Hyde and Lucy had left San Francisco only a couple of weeks previously after spending nearly 6 weeks there. It was devastating. Fires broke out. They lasted for several days. 3,000 people died. 80% of the city was destroyed. And it is remembered as one of the worst and deadliest earthquakes in the history of the United States. Hyde wrote himself in Mahuriska, America, when it was getting dark and I was on the train, I read a notice in the paper that San Francisco was on fire. The story scared me and I waited impatiently until I heard more. It hit my core when I thought about the loyal peoples and the great friends I'd left behind me there. Hyde's understanding of keeping memories, documenting personal data, collecting folklore, the importance of posterity and social historical documents is seen as in his eagerness to keep accurate accounts of his life through ego documents. Today we have photos to record our memories and which also help us to share adventures with others. When Hyde was in America, he had postcards to send to share his adventures with his friends and his 2 children, Nuala and Una, who were living in Ratro, Roscommon at the time. The postcards that had photographs on them had a real quality, and his children would have felt more connected with their father when they received them. They were, in a way, seeing what had been in front of their parents' eyes. Postcards were not expensive, and it was a real pastime of the Victorian era and helped Hyde keep in contact with his girls when he was away for the 8-month period. Here on the screen you can see postcards which Hyde and Lucy sent home. Both show the destruction caused by the earthquake. For example, Lucy sent a postcard to Una just after the San Francisco earthquake, and her message, dated the 26th of April 1906, must have been very hard for her to read and then share with her sister Nuala. The recent earthquake and fire have swallowed up these 5 idols. We just escaped in time. You never would have seen us again if we had remained on. Everything was burnt up. Our grand hotel, an all Chinese town, all burnt, and lots of Chinese too. Save all postcards, all very valuable now. These postcards are in the Aidan Heavey collection in Athlone, County Westmeath. Here we once again see the need for the media to advertise events. Famous Irishman to be guest of honour at Recreation Park this afternoon. And then in another extract, we read about how the event was very successful. This was a common thread stitching all the newspaper articles together. At Recreation Park yesterday, several thousands gathered to witness the sons of Erin take part in their favourite games, hurling and Gaelic football. Dr. Douglas Hyde was the most conspicuous personage in the grandstand. I thought it'd be nice to show these cuttings here because St. Patrick's Day was only a couple of weeks ago. And I'm showing you the edition, the Douglas Hyde edition of the San Francisco Leader that Una collected in her scrapbook. So this newspaper, as I said earlier, was founded by Father Peter York in 1902. And here we have the March 17th edition, 1906. So you can see Douglas Hyde, Lucy Hyde, Glenda Locke and Frank J. Sullivan. The Leader, Dr. Douglas Hyde edition, glowing tribute to Hyde. We see here a discussion about the banquet given to Hyde in the Palace Hotel on Friday the 21st, 1906. The banquet given to Dr. Douglas Hyde at the Palace Hotel was the most brilliant social gathering ever held in San Francisco. So here we have an extract about the big reception that Hyde gave in San Francisco. And it states, "Never did San Francisco give a heartier greeting to an honoured visitor than was extended to Dr. Douglas Hyde at the Tivoli Theatre on Sunday, February 18th. Frank J. Sullivan was the chairman, and we can see his admiration of Hyde in this letter. This letter is housed in the National Library, and he sent it to Douglas Hyde on the 9th of August 1906. My dear friend, I had hoped to meet you once more before you sailed for home, but circumstances did not permit my leaving the city. Since we met here, I have followed closely every line published about your great success in this broad, big-hearted country, and rest assured that the greater your success, the more joy it gave me." The Irish Independent on the 25th of June 1906 documents the arrival of Dr. Douglas Hyde at Kingsbridge Station yesterday evening, Filla an Chríomhain. The hats are raised. Hyde's moustache makes him stand out from the crowd, as you can see here in the picture. There are no women to be seen, and Hyde is taller and dominant. It is a scene of success and jubilation. Even the language used to describe the American tour has spiritual connotations. Here you can see it described as An Chríomhain's mission. The tour itself was publicised as a huge success in papers in Ireland and abroad. Hyde was described as a hero. He was indeed an idol and a superstar upon his return. And it was the media, the newspapers, that helped ensure a celebrity status fell on Hyde. We see Douglas Hyde on the front of the San Francisco newspaper coverage. Impact is twofold when we consider the media coverage of Hyde's visit. Firstly, those who turned out to hear him speak, and secondly, those who read newspaper reports on the speeches. This made it available not just to the Irish in the local area, but also the newspapers back home. It impacted and inspired revivalists back in Ireland. His dramatic personality and ease in speech-making made him a force to be reckoned with when, on his tour of America in 1905-1906. Hyde raised more than $64,000 for the Gaelic League, starting off in Boston in November 1905, and finishing in New York 7 months later. Hyde's American adventure helped prepare him for his academic career as the first professor of modern Irish in UCD, and also as first president of Ireland. Hyde's ability and skill of understanding his audience and adapting accordingly, abstaining from controversy, dealing with the press and rousing audiences with his speech delivery was honed during this trip. Hyde's American adventure was the beginning of a new stage in Hyde's public role in Irish affairs. Míle buíochas gach duine. I would be delighted to receive any questions you might have. Just email me at the address on the screen, máire.niconvord@mu.ie. Thank you very much. Slán go fóill.
Great. I hope everyone could hear the great detail and wonderful paper from Máire and Bhaird during that presentation. Again, we might have, I think, some more scope for discussion at the end of this session, but I want to move on straight away to our final speaker as part of this panel. So Dr. Sophie Cooper is a lecturer in liberal arts at Queen's University Belfast, where she also researches history of migration, gender and religion, focusing on Ireland and its diaspora. Sophie's first monograph, Forging Identities in the Irish World, Melbourne and Chicago, from circa 1830 to 1922, was recently published by Edinburgh University Press. And congrats, Sophie. Her many publications also include articles in Social History and Women's History Review, where Sophie uses urban history and material culture approaches to explore the experiences of Irish women at home and abroad. And Sophie's paper titled today is Emerging from the Sidelines, Reconsidering the 19th Century Irish American Archive. So over to you, Sophie.
Thanks so much, both for inviting me and for everyone being here. So there are two themes that I really want to raise today, and both revolve around kind of where we find the archives of the Irish in America and how that shapes the research that we carry out. Colleagues here and in the audience will be very aware of many of these issues, but I think we could do more to highlight the variety of source collections and the ways that they feed into each other, especially to those who are just beginning and carrying out research in the future. So as more collections are digitized and in some cases professionalized and centralized, I'm thinking particularly around kind of religious orders in the States, we have so many more opportunities to bring more stories in from the proverbial sidelines. And seminars like this and recent ones organised by General Hassett on the coloniality of the Irish Archive and by Niamh McGavin on the built environment, to name just a few, really help us to keep questioning what and where the archive is. And I'm just incredibly grateful for that impetus to kind of consider my own sources and the questions that I'm prompted to research, but also discussions like this, which prompt new questions. So as Barry mentioned, and some of you all know, my first monograph was released last month, and here it is. I don't have a slide, but you can all admire it here. And one of the main arguments in that book is that Irish diasporic communities were largely held together across multiple generations because of the influence of women. This influence was largely unconscious, creating what I call foundational identities in children, often through ethnic mirroring or creating positive role models who looked and sounded like them and their parents. These kind of subconscious, unconscious connections, which included kind of Irish kids being schooled together. So these kind of informal friendship networks that are created in the schoolyard. These could then be seized upon by the kind of more traditionally male culture brokers of priest, publican, and politician in adulthood. And obviously there's brilliant work done on culture brokers. I just think we need to kind of expand who these people are. So James McCartan notes that while priests in the immigrant church have been described as neighborhood chieftains, religious sisters, or women religious nuns, were subordinate to priests. However, in McCartan's word, these women were spiritual authorities of immense significance for the children in their classrooms and objects of reverent respect in the larger community. For this reason, bishops in both Melbourne and Chicago worked with their counterparts in Ireland to bring out Irish religious orders to staff their Catholic parishes, and particularly those who catered to Irish migrant groups. However, though they worked together, these staff members, this Catholic personnel, were very separate. And this is reflected in the archive. So I went to Melbourne, Chicago, Ireland, British archives, online, all of these different places. And everywhere I looked, men dominated, often to the exclusion of women. And these are kind of your traditional archives that I was going to. I tried to cast as wide a net as possible. So for me, these men in the archives were really important. Obviously, we cannot undermine that importance, but the research that I was accumulating was missing some crucial elements, particularly women and children. So digitized newspapers helped in starting to fill in some of these gaps. But it was only when I specifically started looking at schools and St. Patrick's Day events that something started to really stand out. Religious orders were really quite important in the building of Irish communities in both Melbourne and Chicago. And for that reason, there was a lot of effort put into bringing personnel directly from Ireland to cater to Irish migrant communities. But still, finding these women or other non-traditional culture brokers requires looking in different places and asking different questions. And scholars of Black, colonised, LGBTQ+, and gendered history have kind of led the way in this research, reading archives against the grain, finding new or different archives, including oral histories, and questioning the utility of focusing on written sources without question. Now, I have focused on written sources in the book particularly, but I have started working more with kind of material culture and increasingly the built environment as kind of sources. Obviously, for the 19th century, we don't have the opportunity for oral histories, but you work with what you have, I suppose. So I spent a lot of time in the diocesan archives in both Melbourne and Chicago, reading the materials that they had and noticing that there was an odd letter from a nun or letters from women wanting to emigrate to the city from Ireland and asking for a bishop or a priest's help in getting settled. But that was it. Tiny fragments of their existence, even though that I knew that they were there. Lay women, for example, were major fundraisers for the Catholic Church abroad, just as domestic servants were contributing to nationalist campaigns famously. They were even more so contributing financially to the building of churches and schools. In 1855, for example, the so-called lady teachers and pupils of St. Agatha's Academy in Chicago presented the new bishop, Anthony O'Regan of County Mayo, with $100 in gold to aid in building his house. Similarly, in 1859, the lay members of the Holy Family Parish in Chicago donated $1,004 within 10 weeks for stained glass windows. And many women crop up among the names of these subscribers. They were making the vestments of priests. They were organising youth groups. They were teachers. They were organising trade unions. They were there. And women religious or nuns were basically running the social services for Irish migrant communities in Chicago from 1846 and Melbourne from 1857. They were setting up schools, Magdalen laundries, orphanages, reform institutions, hospitals. The Mercy Hospital, for example, in Chicago, for a while, the only public hospital in Chicago, was run by the Sisters of Mercy from 1851. But they only appeared in snippets in the archive. So it was about identifying gaps within the archive and asking why they exist and what they can tell us. And scholars like Michael Rolfe Trouillot and Anne-Laure Stoller highlight this. Stoller argues that instead of viewing the archive as a site of knowledge retrieval, we need to view them as sites of knowledge production. And while Trouillot and Stoller focus on colonial state archives, I think we can use these approaches when engaging with the archives of any major institution, especially a transnational colossus as the Catholic Church. And as Pat and others have mentioned, this kind of colonial element comes in even more when considering Irish language sources. What stories are being made about the Catholic Church through the archival material collected, ignored, or destroyed? Like, this can be nefarious, but it's not always, especially when you're considering a rapidly expanding institution that's largely focused on poor migrant groups. In my research, the structure of religious orders and the diocese is an important example to consider. In Ireland, many female religious orders agreed to come under diocesan control. They reported directly to the bishop and worked within the parish structure. In the diaspora, though, there was more of a power struggle. Orders like the Sisters of Mercy were pontifical orders. They may work with the bishop, and they were, after all, women working within very male-dominated societies in the 19th century, so a high level of tact was involved. But they reported directly to the Pope. They didn't even need to report back to the Mother House in Ireland, though many sisters often kept in contact with others around the world. This limits where you can find their archives and therefore their voices. So it was only when I went to Belmont, North Carolina, to the Mercy Heritage Center there, that I actually found the voices of Chicago's Sisters of Mercy en masse. Now I could see that Agatha O'Brien, who's the Mother Superior of the Sisters of Mercy in Chicago when it first is founded, wrote to papal authorities in Lyon in 1846 to ask for money. I found a letter from Bishop Quarter of Chicago in the diocesan archives in Chicago, but they both put a different spin on it, and actually you can only really see that Quarter's backing them up once you see the original letters. So that's North Carolina and Chicago. But as soon as I went to North Carolina, I could also see the legal documents that O'Brien and her community contracted and signed to ensure that they kept control of their institutions and finances. Suddenly, these women were savvy, powerful, and heavily networked in Chicago, in the US, and internationally. They weren't passive support staff in a system run by men. They were setting up the social services, financing them, finding backdoor tactics to get around different power sharing agreements. In Chicago in the mid-1850s, bishops died, moved on, or went on very long sabbaticals with quite impressive frequency. So relying on the goodwill and good grace of bishops was a bit of a worry for the female religious orders who, while they may not have reported to them, still relied on them heavily for funding and support. So having things written down and legally binding was key to them being able to do their jobs. If I just relied on the diocesan archive, I'd have continued to view these religious women as side characters, useful women who were content to work away in silence, confined by their vows to a life of piety. And the emphasis on diocesan archives, for example, to tell the histories of the Catholic Church has a massive impact on the stories that come out. Though obviously scholars are doing brilliant work on these stories, and Lindsay Byrne, for example, has really shown how to read them against the grain. I'm more saying that I had no idea of the boundaries of collecting practices in the diocesan archive. And I think this, for example, has led to the kind of grand statements about what the Catholic Church was doing in the US and Ireland. We need to be specific about these proclamations. Say the Catholic hierarchy or Catholic bishops, if that's what you're talking about. And those are the archives that you're using. I briefly just want to make another related point, that the collections of Irish America are so disparate, especially in geography. So, for example, the Sisters of Mercy in Chicago, stuff being in North Carolina. I'd like to see some more joined up thinking on this, so that scholars, especially those not based in departments with strong Irish history or American migration expertise, have an idea of the varied places to look for these histories of Irish America. There are the key collections in major libraries, places like NUI Galway, but also in the New York Public Library, the Newbury Library in Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Notre Dame, for example. And many of these have funding opportunities for younger scholars, and this is really brilliant. But I'd like to see some kind of crowd-funded resource list so that we can start to publicly reckon with what counts as the archive of Irish America, and therefore who is being counted as Irish at a collecting level. A database which brings together the fantastic digitizing work of archivists and librarians at NUI Galway, at the Irish universities, but places like Villanova as well, with the archives of Irish diasporic religious orders, for example, with, say, the Huntingdon in California. And, where do Ulster Scots fit into this as well, in how we're actually envisioning an Irish American archive? And I realize I might just be volunteering myself for this. So if this type of resource already exists, please, let's shout about it. But it's not about spoon feeding scholars their sources. It's about giving them an idea of the types of collections that are out there, which they could use, and help them to see where the gaps are. So many collections are hidden in the attics of retirement homes. Patrick Mannion told me about trying to find one of those. And there are so many new approaches and theoretical frameworks being used that we should be sharing our knowledge of collections, not hiding them away from each other. And I'm really delighted that seminars like this exist, so we can continue to learn and share ideas with each other to bring even more perspectives to the archives that we have. Obviously, this knowledge, or that lack thereof, depends heavily on where you're based. But with more Irish diaspora scholars being based outside of Ireland and outside the US, making these collections, digitized or not, more visible is a step to more non-Irish history-based and transnational scholars entering the field and helping those who aren't based at massive, well-funded research institutions or have caring responsibilities, or just live in a world with COVID, to expand the potential histories that they can investigate. So yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophie. We're on time, more or less. We're nearly up to time, but just a few minutes. If there is any questions from those in attendance for any of our speakers, and I know there's one or two in the Q&A section already. Perhaps I can put that one out there. This is perhaps, if I can invite maybe all our speakers maybe to return to being live on screen. This is perhaps for Beth and or Patrick, perhaps. Is narratology an approach called for, that these narratives are being pre-shaped for the writers and for us? Are the writers aware of these shaping narrative forces? So is that something perhaps either of you may be working more on the writing and literary side of things, Beth or Patrick, perhaps? If you want to unmute yourselves.
I suppose I can comment on that. It's probably more in Beth's area.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just add just a very quick thing in terms of the work that I would have been I suppose on Owen O'Connell there. It's just that I would look at the stories that he composed, probably in the late 19th century, early 20th century, very much in the way that the kind of librarian and actually archivist J. Randolph Cox talks about dime novels for modern readers, and says that they're more, rather than actual kind of literary works, they're more kind of works of social history that reflect kind of the views of general views of America between roughly 1860 and 1915. So that's how I approach the work in terms of kind of giving, I suppose, insights into the narratives and comparatives. And the introduction was more from a social history perspective than a literary perspective. So I'd turn it over to Beth, definitely more qualified to look at that question there.
Thank you, Patrick. And I haven't thought particularly about a narratology lens, but just to go along with what you were just saying, Patrick, the novels I looked at vary in terms of their, say, aesthetic quality. where I would say The Parish and the Hill is really interesting. As a narrative, it's very loosely put together. It's a bunch of character sketches that move from character to character throughout the novel. Whereas in terms of if I were just recommending someone to read something that was just an amazing story, I would probably go with Edwin OConnor's The Last Hurrah and his writing style. I'm not sure how much these novelists thought about the influence that their narratives could have. My take is that they did at least hope to write them to be a kind of a retelling of the Irish American past to serve their Irish American present. And so I guess they were intentional in my mind. They were somewhat intentional in that way. I'm not sure if that entirely answers the question, but that's my thought on it right now.
Super. Okay, thanks so much to you both. Maybe I could invite Mr. Dan Carey. He's just notified he's a question to ask, but as a panelist, he has the power to unmute himself and make himself heard. So please go ahead, Dan.
Thank you very much, Barry. And no, this is really such an interesting group of papers and contributions. I'm very much looking forward to reading your books, and thank you all very much. Yeah, one sort of question comment to start with for Beth, and then one for Pádraig. I'm so glad you mentioned Edwin OConnor, and I had it in my notes saying, I bet there Edwin OConnor isn't in there. I'm personally a big fan of The Edge of Sadness, which did win the Pulitzer Prize, but OConnor is one of these now forgotten novelists, and I'm delighted that he's part of your canon. In an earlier generation, before your scheme, I was thinking of James T. Farrell, obviously, in the Chicago setting, and questions about American naturalism and a different kind of stylistic register. But also a different figure, different kettle of fish, of J.P. Donlevy, who is Irish American, but is he writing Irish American literature in the way that you would consider? So it's a question for you, and then my question for Pádraig is different. One was, I was just looking at your illustration. Is there something to do with Don Quixote that it was involved there with on a cattle? I was curious about that. But I was also thinking about the proclivity of T.G. Cahir to broadcast American Westerns, and that kind of resonance and connection with a certain sort of American rural history, if one wants to call it that, registered in film and its kind of mythic dimension. So either if you want to comment on those things, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts.
I'll just say I need to look into more of the earlier literature of the time periods right before my time period that I did. I kind of took off from the 1940s and went in the other direction. James Byrne from Wheaton College, I know does a lot with Farrell, and as does Chris Dowd from University of New Haven. So there are others more qualified, maybe not in the room at the moment, to talk about those than I am, but I will continue my reading. And as far as Edwin OConnor goes, I mean, yeah, he actually is more popular than most of the novelists I covered. So I would say he's not completely forgotten, but he is, yes, certainly one to bring back around even more so. His writing is just beautiful.
Thanks, Jan. Pádraig, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for those both fascinating questions. It was Don Quixote there, so I'm delighted that somebody picked that up. That was one of the texts, actually, that Owen's grandnephew ended up sending me on. He had some papers in his attic as well, as Sophie had said, one of these kind of collections that gets packed away. But one of the things I was really fascinated by was kind of the literature that Owen O'Cahill was engaging with at the time and what kind of shaped his own literary output. So Don Quixote was one of the texts that we had there that I would hedge a bet that Douglas Hyde sent over to him, because in a few of his notes, he thanks him for sending Irish language texts from Dublin over to Michigan for him so that he can kind of keep up, reading in the language. Another one of the texts is actually Cá Fiontra as well, the kind of one of the stories of the Fianna, which was re-released by the Gaelic League, reprinted by the Gaelic League and kind of typed up. So we had that as well. And there's many mentions of the Fianna that he compares things in the American frontier to, you know, the kind of violence of the episodes of the Fianna. And then your second point, and it's brilliant. I mean, the Friday night T.G. Cahir Western actually became like a kind of comforting point, I think, during the pandemic. I moved back in with my in-laws at one stage for nearly probably 6 or 8 months, and my father and I would watch the Westerns every Friday night with a whiskey. So it is a kind of a striking point that it is so popular with people still. And I think that's just something that's really passed down. And I have actually an article coming out hopefully this week that makes mention of the T.G. Cahir Western, you know, in this kind of line of interest, really from Buffalo Bill's kind of Wild West show goes and tours in England in 1888. And then there's massive interest in that in Ireland, even though the show doesn't come to Ireland. And then this kind of fascination with American Western culture really trickles down. You know, we see in the accounts of IRA, men and women during the Revolutionary period, a lot of them mention Buffalo Bill and mention different Westerns to kind of contextualize the violence of that period. And then it goes all the way up really in different facets to the present with this kind of T.G. Cahir. And then obviously the obsession with Garth Brooks as well, the kind of cowboy crooner in Croke Park. I think we could probably explain that in some sense to this kind of fascination with the West as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I must admit, I've also found the T.G. Cahir Westerns rather consoling in some way, which I can't quite account for. I mean, I share American nationality with you, and maybe it's that element of, you know, exile, if you like, without over dramatizing it. But I think it was to do something with the pandemic moment. But yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. And not to steal too many minutes from our next panel, but if I could selfishly just add one very quick concluding question to Sophie. I think you brought in such important points about the maybe change in historiographic practice, about moving on from just the textual sources, but to include more materiality as a corpus of records to study, and also oral history. That obviously may have been, for your own period of study, something that may come later on, but is that something archivists and maybe archives and libraries need to do more of, to be more responsive to maybe, you know, contemporary and kind of maybe pre-contemporary times, and be actively collecting these sources before they're gone?
I mean, I'm not sure, like, you would be more of an expert on that, but I think it's really important. I mean, I'm starting to use more sources from the folklore collection, for example, and obviously they're textual sources, but they are a remnant of oral histories. So I think that is hugely important, and that kind of, yeah, I mean, I think we've seen it in recent debates, especially around mother and baby homes and things like that, that there needs to be, especially from historians, a rethinking of how this hierarchy of sources is approached. So I do think that it's an important conversation. I think it also, you know, there's more scope as kind of more collections, you know, there's maybe not enough physical space, but that kind of the ether of online space, I think that there's maybe a bit more flexibility, but that might just be my, you know, me coming in from a different thing. But I do also think there's a huge amount of material memory being lost. I know, just chatting to some of the archivists at the Sisters of Mercy in North Carolina, where they're saying all of these orders are being closed, and there's nowhere to put all of, you know, all of the religious material culture that they have. So they're having to make, and they've got halls of this stuff, and they're having to make these decisions about what is kept and what isn't. So I mean, all questions, and for a whole other webinar perhaps. I think a huge thanks to all our panelists. You've all thrown up such intriguing questions that, you know, will continue on long after today's discussions are over. And I think, as all of us as archivists and historians and others, they'll certainly continue. We've ran a little bit over, so it just proves webinar or events in person or online, some things never change. But I think it was a good problem, and I think everyone was certainly thankful and grateful to all your discussions. So I'll pass straight over to our chair for the next panel, who is Dr. Roisin Healy of History here at NUI Galway. And my thanks to you, Roisin, for chairing this panel, and I'll pass straight over to you.
Thanks, Barry. That was a great first panel. Many thanks for all of that. I'm just reminded I spent the weekend sorting out my late mother's papers, and so the kind of decisions and dilemmas that you've been describing about trying to decide what to keep and what to throw out is something that faces a lot of people, I think, over the course of their own lifetimes. So for anybody who's just joining us, you're very welcome to the second panel of today's webinar, Sources and Voices, Archives, Writing and the Irish Diaspora. We've heard a lot in the first panel about various different kinds of sources that are available to historians of the diaspora, fiction, scrapbooks, newspapers, materials, and various kinds of archives, including diocesan archives. This panel is going to focus in particular on one type of source, emigrant letters, but I think you'll see that it's an especially rich one, and it addresses to some extent the kind of concerns we've heard about in terms of marginal voices. The panelists will be able to talk more fully about this, but includes, as I understand, women's voices, Irish language sources. So perhaps a broader range of voices that sometimes don't get heard. So the panel is meant as a way of introducing the new Kirby Miller collection, which is a veritable treasure trove to potential researchers. I'm delighted to have been asked to chair. Great thanks to Barry Houlihan for asking me. I have an interest in migration history, and I've also been following the progress of the acquisition of the archive in my capacity as member of the Archive Strategy Committee. And with me this afternoon are the three colleagues most closely involved with the acquisition and management of this vast collection of transcripts of Irish emigrant letters that NUI Galway has been so fortunate to receive due to the great generosity of Kirby Miller. And they're going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes in the order given in the programme, and I'll introduce each in turn. So our first speaker in this panel is Breandáin Suibhne. He's a stúrthóir or director of Acadamh na Hoscaileachta Gaeilge, which is a school for Irish language education located within the College of Arts here at NUI Galway. He's a historian of society and culture in modern Ireland and the author of several books, most notably the award-winning The End of Outrage, Post-Famine Adjustment in Rural Ireland. And Breandáin is currently at work on books dealing with Southwest Donegal and a broader history of the Irish poor during the time of the famine. And more importantly, for our purposes this afternoon, he's also been busy working behind the scenes to help NUI Galway acquire this collection. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about Kirby Miller, the genesis of the collection, why and how it came to be housed at NUI Galway, and its significance for the history of Ireland, especially the west of Ireland. So I'll hand over to you now, Breandáin.
Thank you, Roisin. I'm very grateful to Barry for inviting me, and the previous session was, I must say, quite excellent. We often despair for the humanities, but with the quality of the various papers, I really don't think we have all that much to worry about. The work of Kirby Miller would be familiar to any of the participants in this webinar. All of you would be familiar, I imagine, with his Magisterial Emigrants and Exiles, published in the mid-1980s. Kirby commenced work on that in the previous decade when he was a graduate student at Berkeley. And he'd initially intended to do work on urban history. In time, he drifted towards Irish history. He was going to do a dissertation on the Irish and race, but got diverted into the history of migration. And taking a lead from Arnold B. Schreer, who'd done a history of Irish migration in the 1950s, published it in the late 1950s, he recognized the importance of emigrant letters as a source for emigrants' own understanding of their experience. So he consulted Schreer's collection, and he also set himself to collecting additional material, transcribing all the emigrant letters he could find and incorporating them into his analysis. And that work went on through the 1970s into the 1980s. As part of it, he placed adverts in Irish local newspapers asking people to send him materials if they had any old emigrant letters, which he would copy and return. The reason here that he did that is that he discerned a certain resentment in Irish academia at Arnold Schreer having come in and collected originals. Be that as it may, it's possible a lot of the materials that Kirby collected and transcribed and then returned, but for his transcription, no copy would today survive. We may have lost some of the originals. But the larger point is that by the time he published Emigrants and Exiles, he estimated that he had read some 5,000 Irish emigrant letters. And he has continued to collect material through the late 80s, through the 90s, the noughties, and the last decade. And he still gets contacted by people offering him material, which he will be continuing to donate. I would have got to know Kirby personally in the 1990s when I was a graduate student. In the early noughties, mid-noughties, I was editor of a journal in Dublin, Field Day Review, and we carried a review of a book by Kirby by T.H. Breen, and we kind of renewed our friendship around that time. And Field Day published Kirby's collected essays. And from that, we've had a lot of interaction over the years. And I became aware that this voluminous collection of materials was at some stage going to go somewhere. Coming here to the Moore Institute in 2016, I impressed upon Kirby that Galway would be a very good location for the material in terms of the interests of faculty, people like Roisin, for instance, and others in the history department, but also because the university has experience of developing databases. But my key sentimental arm twist was that the transcripts that Kirby has assembled are transcripts of letters that were sent to Ireland, so that it would have been only appropriate that they ultimately come to Ireland. And I wasn't employed by the university at the time, so John Cox of the Hardiman Library, Dan Carey of the Moore Institute, and others, Aisling Keane, Kieran, many others, worked with Kirby to figure out what would happen to the materials if they came here. And the idea evolved of a database that would be available online that would allow the entire collection to be searched. And that is a project for which we've got some initial seed funding from a strategic fund of the university. And we are hoping to have, aiming to have, a rudimentary database that can go online by Patrick's Day next year. And in time, we will deepen that database to be able to go from searching for the names of senders and recipients and locations and keyword searches, to a much more sophisticated topical search. It's an engrossing project. I was chatting to Kieran today, Dan and I were chatting to Kieran today, who's completing a box listing of the collection. And he said the challenge is not to be diverted by the material, or one of the challenges is not to be diverted by the material and to go down a little rabbit hole of wondering what happens next in a series of correspondence. It's going to be a remarkable resource for the university. Anybody in North America who comes to do their family history, particularly anybody who tries to put historical meat on the bare bones of genealogy, will in time come to know of the Kirby Miller collection at NUI Galway. And it's a project that can run and run. It is something that with this base, this foundation, we can continue to collect material. Last Patrick's Day last year, we got a deal of publicity on RTE, the Irish Times, the Daily Mail, the Sunday Independent, about the collection. And we were contacted by several people, many people in fact, offering us additional materials. So there are thousands of emigrant letters out there, tens of thousands perhaps, that in time may be added to this collection. So it's a remarkable resource and one we're looking forward to developing. Okay, Rashi.
Thanks very much, Wanda. That was a great introduction to the collection, and thanks again for all your work on it. We wouldn't have it without you, so we really appreciate that.
Very much a group effort. Very much a group effort.
Well, I think it's important also, yeah, that you acknowledge all the other people involved. And our second speaker, Professor Dan Carey, is also one of those who was very prominent in securing the collection. He spoke there a little while ago, but I'll introduce him formally. He's director of the Moore Institute for the Humanities and Social Studies at NUI Galway and professor of English in the School of English and Creative Arts. He's a vice president of the Royal Irish Academy and is current acting director of the Irish Research Council. So he's going to describe to us now the university's ambitious plans for the archive in terms of funding and access. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Roisin. Yeah, and I'm really picking up on things that Breandáin was saying, and really a sense of excitement attached to our relationship to this particular resource, which is really something incredible. And the more you look at it, the more mind-boggling it is that a finite individual, Kirby Miller, was able to do what he has done. I think anybody actually witnessing this would really be truly amazed. So I'll say a little bit about the database dimension and some of the interests of this collection, which is enormous, as Breandáin's already made clear. But just one thing to clarify, I mean, one of the innovations and really interesting ways that Kirby went about it, I mean, many of these things come from things like the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland and other collections in Cork and elsewhere in the country. But he also put advertisements in often obscure publications in the Farmer's Journal and so forth, seeking in effect, donations from people. They weren't strictly donations. People would send letters to him. He would photocopy them, transcribe them, and return them to the senders. So some of this is just through his incredible patience. He had a few graduate students working with him, but to do this in the time that he was doing it and the way that he did it is really, truly remarkable. So the potential, obviously, of ingesting this material within a database is enormous because of the search possibilities that a database makes possible. And as Breandáin was already indicating, we hope to add to it in various different kinds of ways through future donations. That's getting a little ahead of ourselves, naturally. But what we would do with a structured database is obviously create a series of search fields, and those would have such things as basic information like the sender, the recipient, the gender of those parties, obviously the date, and hopefully that's indicated on most of the letters, not on all of them. Clearly the location from which they were sent and where they were received. The text of the letters themselves, again, through optical character recognition, we hope to be having a high standard of reproduction of the text itself, courtesy of the transcriptions that Kirby made. And there are many thousands of letters. We don't know exactly how many, and that process of cataloging that Kieran will tell us more about in a moment will give us a little bit more sense of the scale. But this will make it searchable, of course, by a whole series of different kinds of themes and keywords. But there's also great visualization potential, obviously, using geotagging to really get a sense of the parts of the country that were sending out people, where people were engaging with relatives around Ireland, and the different parts of the US, whether they were urban or rural, and some of them are very far afield, not always in places that you would expect. In terms of the audiences that we think will be served by this resource, I mean, obviously historians stand out, in particular, those who are interested in the social and economic history of the immigrant experience in different kinds of ways, but also people engaged by genealogy. And, you know, in my own case, the Irish side of my family left in the famine, as so many did, ended up in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So I was pleased to hear of a Rhode Island connection in the with Beth earlier on. We don't have any surviving letters, but for me, it's very compelling to think that I might be able to hear some of the voices of that time period is a very powerful thing, very powerful thing. In terms of the thematic dimensions of this collection, there's much to be said. Our models in terms of databases, there are different kinds of things that we can draw on. Obviously, there's genealogical websites and the way that they structure data, which I think will be of interest. There's also a couple of resources that I'm familiar with. Early Modern Letters Online was a very interesting project run out of Oxford that's been really remarkably successful. There's also a project that people might be familiar with in Ireland of Letters of 1916 that was run out of Maynooth. So again, there's different ways in which people have looked at the letter as a basic unit and tried to structure data around it. To think briefly about the kind of thematic dimensions. Just on the literary side, to start with that, which is partly because it's my own academic background, there's the question of the genre of the letter. People are writing in a mode. There's certain forms of formulaic language, also a formulaic emotional dimension, as well as a more heartfelt and distinctive emotional register to these letters, which is important to capture. But there's also important not to forget the kind of language and distinctive vocabulary that people use. How do they express themselves? How does that change over time? There's a lot of concentration in the letters, really, I suppose, in the period from 1850 to 1950, I think, is the greatest concentration, but there's some that go back to the 17th century and some later than that. In terms of the historical dimensions of this and interest of it, there's obviously social and cultural history. There's economic history, which is registered in different ways, partly in remittances, but also in the forms of work that people engaged in. And I thought I would just read a few lines from a letter that I was looking at earlier. This is when Kieran was showing us the work that he's been doing. And, this one was just almost, to hand when I was looking at one of the boxes just today. So this is William Johnston in Lockport, Indiana, writing to Alan Hamilton in Fort Wayne, Indiana, June 16th, interesting date, 1851. Dear sir, enclosed you will find $15, which I want you to take the trouble to send to Ireland for me. My wife has a sister and a brother-in-law in that ill-fated and unfortunate country, and they are very poor. It is all that I'm able to send at present. If I'm able, I would send them $50 to bring them to Canada, but this will be some help to them, the money he's sending. I wonder if Ireland is ever going to be any better than it is. From everything that I can learn, it is every year getting worse. What a pity it is that a country blessed by nature and nature's God with everything that can make man happy and comfortable, but now one of the most wretched countries upon the face of the earth by the tyranny of man. I made a good escape out of it. If I had not come the time I did, I would have been an inmate in the poorhouse long before this. So just a few lines that capture, again, an aspect of economic history of a remittance, but also of the relationship of somebody who had departed the country. There are distinctive family relationships that are in evidence in these letters and of networks of correspondence within families. The dimension of gender history is quite powerful. We're looking at the experience of a lot of women immigrants, but also of wives left behind in some cases. The history of participation in various different kinds of political organizations. There's also confessional difference, which is noteworthy. And then narratives of major events on both sides of the water. And finally, just partly because it speaks to my own academic interests, I mean, there's so much to this material, but I was struck in looking at it and thinking about it, about the element of this as forms of travel writing. And many of these documents actually are also accompanied by memoirs of one kind and another that Kirby has also been assiduous in collecting. But these are memorials of trips, journals, of voyage accounts of one kind and another. So I think even the dimension of travel writing is something that we should look to and think about as a resource made possible by this collection. So we can hand over now back to Roisin to introduce our next speaker, Kieran.
Great, thanks, Dan. And that was very interesting to hear the voices from the archive there, the poignant evocation of poverty in Ireland, and of course that concern about the homeland is something that we see with the latest wave of emigrants here coming to Ireland, indeed all over Europe with the current Ukrainian diaspora. So we're now going to have our final speaker, Kieran Hoare, who's an archivist at NUI Galway and also is completing a PhD in history. And he has had extensive experience cataloguing numerous acquisitions in the archives, and is going to talk to us a little today about the mechanics of the kind of database that's being constructed. I'll hand over to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Roisin. And first of all, thank you to the organisers, certainly for the opportunity to talk here today. I suppose kind of following on from Breandáin and Dan, what I want to talk about a bit and to say a few words on really is just the process of bringing in the Kirby Miller collection to the archives here at NUI Galway Library. Talk a little bit then about how the collection is organised and the kinds of information you'll find in each file. And I'll give you a few examples of that then towards the end, and what is in the collection and how it can kind of tie into research as well. I suppose this has been alluded to earlier, but just to say that as with any large collection, it's very much a team effort. Our digital archivist, Aisling Keane, was very much involved in the initial discussions to bring in the collection from the library side, as well as planning the accession process. Killian Joy, also here in the library, has been very involved in the technical side of digitisation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a while, and in establishing workflows and timelines. And our academic colleagues, as you've heard there, Breandáin and Dan, have given us a lot of strategic insights, a kind of a framework for research and kind of where we're going with the project, and the drive behind bringing in the collection as well. In my view, ultimately, it's this complete package of preservation, digitisation, access and research, which gave Kirby confidence in NUI Galway and a home for his collection. And I think more generally, when you're looking at academic repositories or archival repositories in academic institutions, it's the fact that you can both digitise, preserve physically and intellectually the material, but also the fact that it's close to researchers, close to research funding, allowing access both at the academic level, but also more to the general public as well. That gives a collection like this a unique a blend of and a unique opportunity to bring a group of people together. I suppose I should say as well that there were, of course, many challenges in bringing in the 45 packing boxes, I suppose you'd call them, which equate to around 130 archival boxes of material from Columbia, Missouri to NUI Galway. This was done in the later end of 2020, in the midst of the global pandemic and all that entailed. Just when we thought things were going well, we brought the material through Dublin Port and the various custom checks in early January 2021. But of course, this was just as the impact of Brexit was being felt, and that had an impact on our couriers as well. And once it was in our storage here in the library, access was again limited by various public health regulations. So I suppose it kind of was very interesting to bring the collection in with all of these things going on, if you like. I don't know, interesting is the right word. It certainly presented a number of challenges. But on the plus side, I mean, I would have to say as well that the collection had been organised so meticulously by Kirby and his wife Patricia over the years, with over, I would estimate, 1,400 files of material or individual groups of letters, organised by a writer or groups of writers, and showing clearly the order in which Kirby worked on the files and used them in his work on the Irish exodus to North America. The material itself, I suppose, has been collected by a number of academics, and I suppose Kirby's at the centre of it. But it should be said that the collection has been brought together by a few academics over the years from a range of private donors and public repositories, and was used in a number of publications and research projects, reflecting over 70 years of collecting material in this area relating to the lived Irish immigrant experience in North America through letter and memoir writing. Much of the early collecting was done in the 1950s by Dr. E.R.R. Green, who was based in Manchester, and Dr. Arnold Schreer. Dr. Green published his Ulster Emigrant Letters in 1969, but in the course of his research gathered a lot of letters both from crony and private donors in Ulster in the early 1950s. Arnold Schreer, when he was collecting letters in Ireland in the mid-1950s, cast his net wider, using immigrant letters and oral reminiscences for his book on Ireland and the American immigration, 1850 to 1900, which was published in 1958. While many of these letters, particularly from Ulster, can date back to the early 18th and the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many of those writing or receiving letters or writing memoirs, voyage journals and so on, were within the living memory of the donors of materials. And these donors' letters to the collectors often provide contextual information of our family background, religious and political affiliations and so on. So that was very important, that it kind of almost merged the written word with the kind of the oral tradition within families as well, about maybe aunts and uncles who were in the States, different branches of the family where they ended up and so on. Another collector who comes through in the collection is Dr. Bruce Bowling, who was collecting in the 1970s, particularly Irish language material relating to emigration, with material collected not only from private sources, but institutions such as the Irish Folklore Archive, the Irish Folklore Commission. And again, you have not only the word written in Irish language material at the time, but things like poems, songs, different things like that. So it wasn't just a written tradition, it was also kind of an oral tradition as well. And again, I suppose the Folklore Commission would have linked into a lot of that. But the primary collector, obviously, of the material in the collection is Kirby himself, as Breandáin and Dan have shown already, who is gathering material from the mid-1970s up to the present in a range of repositories, both in Ireland and North America. And again, the breadth of the range of where he went for material is phenomenal. Canada, England, but more regularly in Ireland, but also in the States as well. Various historical societies, the Indiana Historical Society, Berkeley in UCL, a lot of academic and kind of state archives and libraries were utilised. As well as those copies mentioned in private hands. And again, he kind of reached out through the local papers, as Breandáin has said, but also I think he had a network of people who knew he was interested in that area. So you find a lot of librarians sending him on to people, local history societies here sending him on material as well. So it is quite a phenomenal amount of material. And this work of gathering, copying originals and transcribing forms the bedrock of what's in these 1,400 or so files. There's also the contextual information, not only from the information of private donors and repository descriptive lists, but also from the collaborative efforts between the various collectors themselves. So you find a lot of correspondence between Kirby and Arnold, for example, going through what's in the collection, where he got certain letters from. Were there any leads he could give on gaining information? But also through, I suppose, the extensive research that Kirby and other researchers in Ireland and North America had done, as well as a range of research correspondence between Kirby with these donors, librarians, archivists, and local researchers. This research and research correspondence adds invaluable context to letters, which were probably only written for the recipients, or memoirs or journals which were written for family and friends, and occasionally written with the wider public in mind. this contextual information, both written and from family oral tradition, arranged into the files held in the collection, provides a treasure trove of information for researchers and additional information as well. I suppose kind of looking at the themes then, and for the researcher going through the collection, certain themes become apparent, and these have been touched on already, but I might run through a few of them as well. Some of these have already been explored in Kirby's publications, but there are also many themes and individual examples which remain to be explored. The late 18th and early 19th century immigrant often had a business or trade, or was involved in business or had a trade, or is seeking to establish a landholding in the New World. You do see a divide. The famine is a sort of a divide, really, between perhaps a more positive spin on the British involvement in Canada and bringing settlers to Canada, for example, and then the later one of people being forced out of the country, and as Dan was pointing out there, the position of Ireland under English rule. It was a more positive experience, really, in the 1820s, 1830s, but that all changes very dramatically from the 1840s on. Although you do have that kind of business element, landed element, if you like, the younger sons of landed gentry and so on coming out, people in the professions, people in the trades. There is a radical character to some of the emigration, particularly from Ulster, with former United Irishmen, and they're kind of viewed at America, this idealized view of America that was held in Ireland in the later 18th century, kind of follows through to the next generation, particularly in places like Antrim and Down. In the 1810s, 1820s. And it kind of also shows perhaps something certainly I hadn't really considered, but which is kind of evident, the importance of Canada as an initial destination, and the role of Liverpool as a port of embarkation. I suppose really you see Liverpool rather than Queenstown or Cove being the centre of taking the transatlantic journey at that time. What is a flow, or a fairly regular flow of immigration in the 1820s and 1830s really becomes a deluge during the famine. Across the island of Ireland, the experience of want and hunger is clear in the letters, and you see that both north and south. It doesn't differentiate really. Whole families emigrate, with many of the labouring class finding passage, bringing out their family after them, or siblings. You find in a lot of the memoirs, particularly from the 1870s or 1880s, are written by children who are either very young when they emigrate, or the children of immigrants who emigrate in the 1840s and 1850s. So there's a very clear change there. You also see it reflected in the political change as well. So the Young Ireland movement is very evident, say in the 1840s. The influence of Davis, and indeed a number of the Young Irelanders find themselves in the States in the 1850s, or get away from Australia to the States in the 1850s. But you find that giving away then, particularly after the American Civil War, or during the American Civil War, to more militant Fenian movement. And again, things like the Land League, the Gaelic League, and the push for independence in early 20th century Ireland. All of these are reflected in the letters, and the letters going back and forth between family members discussing politics. The experience of immigrants in the States also changes. So livelihoods become, I suppose they move more into the unskilled areas, and people move around a lot during their time in the States. And again, this is where Kirby's research is so interesting, because, you know, someone might move to begin in New York or Boston, move out to somewhere like Chicago, end up in somewhere like California or Washington State. You can see the move not simply westwards, but also kind of over and back across the states, up into Canada, back down again. So it's kind of what Dan was saying there about the voyage journals. You certainly have a good number of those, but even travel within the states and kind of interstate migration by Irish immigrants is very interesting. And I suppose the other thing then is that the letters and the memoirs show the evolution and the creation and evolution of Irish America. As mentioned already, the written word of women also comes to the fore. Probably early on, you would say it's a very passive role. Now, as mothers or sisters back home in Ireland, where people are sending remittances or sending filial greetings and that sort of thing. You get an awful lot of that in the 1820s and 30s. But you do find then that from the 1840s onwards, Irish women are looking to come to the States. Either you find that people are being, families are left behind with a view to bringing them out in time. And that's not always a good experience. There are examples of wives coming out with their children only to find that their husband has passed away. So they're writing back home saying about the position they're in. You have the lived experience of Irish women in the States also comes out. So again, where they're working, where they're involved in different activities, kind of trying to keep the families together, that comes out very strongly as well. And I suppose really what the letters give is, but also the memoirs to a degree, is it gives an immediacy and a contingency to the diaspora's experience. Kind of highlights their homesickness that comes across in all the letters, across denominations, across eras, their interactions with the new land and society, their familial and friendship structures, their striving for a livelihood and their hopes and aspirations for themselves and their children, the country they left behind, and as well as what's happening in their new country. And I might just kind of end, as it were, then. Sorry, now the lights have gone off here, so give me 1 second just to get them going. I know there's a good number of you who know the archives, that the office goes into darkness every now and again. And it's not that I'm staying still, it's that the sensor is away a bit away from me. But if I could kind of go and just talk a little bit now about kind of particular groups of letters within the collection, just to give you an idea of what's there. I suppose one collection that caught my eye were the Hurley brother letters. So Michael and Dennis Hurley would be from Clonakilty in mid-Cork, and they both emigrated as teenagers, 15 and 17 years old respectively, in 1883. They moved initially to Carson City, which was just being set up. Michael was the older brother. He had a very good head for business. He bought up property early in Carson City, became a very, a prominent prominent citizen, I should say, of Carson City. Set up a saloon, set up a hotel, bought up property, basically developed a good business in Carson City. He was also involved in particularly Catholic organizations. He was a member of the Knights of Columbanus, for example, would have marched with them during Patrick's Day parades in Carson Cities from the 1890s onwards. And built, he never married, but he did build, I suppose, a respectable life for himself, which he never tired of telling his brother Tig back in Clonakilty about. He also wrote letters to his mother before he started writing to his brother, and also to his niece Bridget. So from the 1880s right down to the 1930s, you have, I suppose, 106 letters in all from well, 104 letters from Michael and 2 letters from his brother Dennis in the collection that found its way into the Cork Archives Institute. Kirby would have been aware of these letters in the 1970s, would have gotten a copy of these letters and transcripts of the letters. Michael's brother Dennis, who travelled out with him to Carson City, you get the sense that he was a more happy-go-lucky character than Michael. He went to San Francisco, and from the letters, just reading through the letters, there's very little, there's no mention at all of Dennis after 1906. So of course the implication is that, or the assumption was that he'd passed away in the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906 that Máire was mentioning earlier. What Kirby managed to do, however, was to go track down information on both brothers, both in Carson City and in San Francisco. And what he uncovered, and like, again, if you just had the letters in themselves that are in the Cork Archives Institute, you wouldn't know the whole life that Dennis had. He became a fireman in San Francisco. He was involved in the earthquake in 1906, but survived it. He married a Chinese lady, settled in San Francisco, lived away there until the 1920s. His wife had passed away by that stage, but Michael brings Dennis back to Carson City, looks after him until he dies in 1931, and he dies himself in 1935. But he never mentions this in the letters back home to Clonakilty, whether there was a falling out between Dennis and Tig, the brother in Clonakilty, whether Dennis didn't want people to know what his life was like in San Francisco, whether Michael felt that he didn't want to be telling them then. Whatever the reason was, there was no mention in the letters. But what Kirby did was uncover this whole life that was going on in Carson City. And Michael's last letter to his niece Bridget, which he writes from a nursing home in Carson City in 1935, it's very poignant. He talks about his brother Tig bringing him, how he dreamt the previous night of his brother Tig bringing him for his first day in school, in national school in Clonakilty, kind of remembering going into the classroom, sitting down at the desk, kind of all of those memories, very poignant memories from a man who'd made a life for himself, a business for himself, had developed this life in the States, kind of lived the American dream to many, to a large extent, but who kind of, when it was coming to his last days, was remembering family, remembering the farm in Clonakilty, his life growing up in Clonakilty as well, being so important and so integral to him. So that's just one example out of the 1,400 of the files that are there. And I just kind of give it as an example to kind of show, you know, it's the transcripts and the letters are there, and that's all wonderful. But that contextual information that's there as well can also offer great insights into the lived experience of immigrants there. So I might leave it there, Roisin, and leave it open to questions. And again, if anyone has any questions around the collection or project, feel free to contact me at any stage.
Thanks, Kieran. You elaborated very nicely there on the history of the collection, and I think it's a great early example of the kind of collaboration that Sophie Cooper was calling for earlier, collaboration between scholars and archivists collecting and preserving this material. And of course, it's sort of you're at the next stage in the process of trying to make this material available to people and hopefully, you know, continue that that collaborative work. And I think you also gave a very good sense of Kirby Miller and what he contributed as a historian and the way he mined these letters for all sorts of different themes. And that example that you gave of the Hurley brothers was marvelous, because you see so many different things. And I'm thinking that having this made available more widely also allows people with new research questions to ask them of the sources, and maybe not so new ones. I'm thinking of, say, questions about Irish American links with other ethnic groups, and you mentioned there that one of the Hurleys married a Chinese woman, and of course there's a lot of interest now in, say, Black Irish identities, and there may be some potential for that perhaps, or increasing interest in, say, the role of disability and migration, or the interlinks there, and perhaps, you know, new questions can be asked as these arise. No, I don't see any questions there, but I from the audience, but I just wanted to sort of follow up on that and ask you, or perhaps Dan or Breandáin, about I suppose the difficult question of choosing keywords. I mean, some keywords are obvious. You know, you've talked about, you know, religious identities and counties and places of emigration and so forth, but to what extent can you kind of anticipate the future needs of researchers by putting in keywords there that might be of interest to them?
Yeah, I might jump in there in response to that. Yeah, I think that, you can, of course, anticipate what people might be interested in, but essentially they're going to divide, a bit like how we use Google. They're going to come up with their own keywords and their own strings and things. So I think that there may be some prompts which we think are particularly areas of concentration, which might have their own a kind of pedagogic value in terms of people's anticipating things that they might be interested in. But I think a lot of the use of it really through searching the full text feature of a database would be people really having their own individual words that they're interested in. Now, they may have particular families, they might be familial relationships that they're interested in, all the letters in which daughters write to father, or etc. That kind of thing might be a particular thing, or it might be obviously a certain location, a time period, or an event in particular. Is there any commentary on, the American Civil War, for example, these other great cataclysms of that people would have experienced? So I suspect that will be the kind of usage. And I've worked on preparing a couple of databases myself, and I know there's only so much anticipation you can do in that sense. So you're right.
Breandáin, I think, wants to get in there too.
Following on from the gentleman who considers the Farmer's Journal to be obscure, I
won't live that down.
Lift that one down. I would say that when the material is digitized, Roisin, the transcripts are digitized, you'll be able to search for a word. So any letter that mentions marmalade, we'll be able to find very easily. You'll be able to find any letter that mentions Clon and Rail, for example. But nationalism might not necessarily, can be expressed without the name of an organization. So there is a need to deepen the digitization, but you're going to get from the digitization by, in older parlance, indexing the material.
Mm. And ultimately, there's no substitute offer for the historian just reading through certain things and with a kind of an alert eye to these things. And of course, you'd have to account for numerous variations of the spelling of Clon and Rail or things like that. Actually, having scrolled down now, I see there are a few questions, so I'll refer to those. So the first is from Margaret Breheny here, and she comments that the transnational reach of the collection and database is also very exciting, and some of the letters refer to an emigrant who moved on to a third country from the US to Cuba, and letters sent to his aunt in Dublin from his coffee plantation provide a rich context for work on Irish settlement and pro-slavery ideologies in Cuba, already the subject of one PhD. So that's a real affirmation of the kind of the richness of the material that you have there. From Mike Lynch, was wondering if you'd be able, Kieran, to share the metadata fields you're planning, because he's working on a similar project using letters from his grandmother in Cavan to his father in New York.
Yeah, definitely. So again, I suppose we would follow the international standard for archival description as the standard metadata that you would use. Now, again, this has been kind of modified into MODS, which is a metadata standard, if you like, for digital objects. So there are a few, and I know Mike would know these very well, the kind of standards that have been developed by the Library of Congress through encoded archival description, for example, that we would use as well. So there are a few standards there. that would be at the back of what we do. Now, again, a lot of the digitization software packages that are available, like Islandora, will actually steer you towards those anyway. They use those standards as the model to work on. And it's really just a case of filling the metadata fields. Kind of going back to the earlier question first, I mean, I think, for example, there's a whole history of emotion kind of inside in the letters there, that it's an area that's developing, that has developed and continues to develop. But again, as Breandáin and Dan say, how you capture that, how you bring that into a standard is one thing. I think the most you can do with descriptive lists and with digital objects is to kind of steer people in the right direction. You use those standards for place names, personal names, subject areas that the Library of Congress have, for example. You'd use those. But you can't really direct people into specific areas. Their research will lead them into those, I think, really. So I would say for Mike's question, just things like the standards that you have in the Library of Congress, the International Standard for Archival Description, the International Standard for names and places and corporate identities. There are a few different standards like that you can use. And again, other metadata that we will be putting in there will be subject areas. We'll also be using geographical and temporal subject headings as well. So there are a few areas there. What I might do is just send them on to Mike directly if he wants to get in contact with me. I could run through the list of what's there, certainly.
Thanks. Now, there are two questions that deal with the transcription. So somebody's asking, are you just relying on Kirby Miller's own transcriptions, and that other people have worked on them and there are transcription debates? And I'm just going to pick up the first half of the next question, which is just asking about the methodology, to what extent you've access to the original letters, and if his copies were handwritten copies, and if this poses any difficulties.
When Kirby would have received the material, if he received when he received original letters, he photocopied the original letters, and then either he or graduate student assistants would have transcribed them. Okay, these are the ones that did not come from libraries, and he would have transcribed them in libraries himself, etc. In answer to Patrick O'Sullivan's question, what we're doing on the one instance is we're receiving a scholar's research materials, and these research materials, the transcripts of all these letters, are of great interest in the wider, in the wider world, among scholars and among non-scholars indeed. And we're trying to make that material available. We're not trying to resolve questions about transcriptions. I would say Kirby Miller's own transcriptions are quite remarkable in that he would break the line of his transcription where the line broke in the original letter. So it's to get it's to facilitate access to the material. The photocopies, originals, images of those will also be available on the database. So if there is a question, if there is a little problem, they are things that people can resolve themselves. But this is a project that is academic. It's a project that is genealogical. It's something that allows us to connect across time with people in the past, but it also allows people who are descended from immigrants to connect back across the Atlantic with the place those people left behind. We're approaching this as the construction of a database. We are not approaching this as the people who are doing the research on the million questions that this database can help us answer. Where NUI Galway is making this material available. Yeah, and in terms of the other, sorry, Dan, I think I answered the second part of that too, Dan.
No, I was just going to come in with a few points provoked by your comments and Kieran's. we would also anticipate, obviously this is in more fully imagined versions of the database, various teaching resources would obviously be a welcome addition to it. There's also the potential, which could take different forms of linked data. I mean, there's potentially linked data with the Landed Estates project, which is also an NUI Galway project, which has remarkable reach associated with Growth of Thuig and Mary Bourne and the library and other colleagues. Census records and a variety of different things of that kind. I think in potentially, if we have the resources, could be integrated into it as well. So I think the reach there is really quite substantial when you start to imagine it more fully as a digital resource in particular.
And just to follow up there in terms of Carol Ann Madden's question, do you see Kirby Miller's own collecting interests emerging? Yeah. You know, the database will maintain the integrity of the Schreier collection, which is part of it, and the Miller collection up to the point that it came to NUI Galway. So one will be able to see how Kirby Miller worked as a historian. As Kieran has remarked to me earlier today, never has NUI Galway received a collection that has been so well curated by the person who assembled it. If anybody were to receive my files, they would be in a very disheveled state and it would take them years to put order on it. But Kirby's comes, you know, as a dream for John Cox and Kieran and everybody else in the library. It's meticulously curated by himself. But our priority is to make this material available to people. To make it accessible to people so that it can be used for research, can be used in education, can be used in arts and culture projects. And in terms of the more arcane questions people might have about, you know, they're things that researchers can in time come and address. You know, for sure there's going to be questions about the representative nature of the collection. For an earlier period, the North will be overrepresented. To what extent is the West represented? To what extent are women represented, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you will see the volume of material that one of the great scholars of the last 50 years assembled and how he went about his work. And you will have before you a remarkable resource for the history of 18th, 19th, 20th century Ireland and America.
Thanks, Breandáin. Just another question that came in as the second part of a question from Hilary Lennon, leads us in a slightly different direction, and she's asking about the class kind of categories of the material, given the low rate of literacy among many of the Irish immigrants.
Well, literacy, of course, as we would know, like literacy increases from the mid-19th century, but you don't achieve full literacy. The earlier letters would be disproportionately Protestant. Kieran can correct me. Kieran is now the world authority on the collection.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think what you find, the literacy of the earlier letters is very florid, and that kind of ties in a bit to what Dan was saying earlier. It's a very stylized way of writing. So even kind of a very formal way of writing. So even letters to parents, you see a very formal way of writing, almost like a school exercise way of writing. When you come to the 1860s, 1870s, there definitely is a class division there. And Kirby brings it out very well. I think this was one of Kirby's interests, was the kind of the working class Irish coming to the States, developing there. You know, I mean, you see it. Well, I suppose you do see it a little earlier with the trades as well. There's one example, for example, of the Flynns. Bernard Flynn from Philadelphia, writing to his brother Morris in Birmingham. They're both printers by trade. And it's a very dry letter, you know, kind of discussing the cost of materials and different things in printing. But the donor's letter actually talks about how the family had been evicted from their home in Bohola in County Mayo moved across to Birmingham. The three brothers, there were three brothers in the family, all became printers by trade. They went to night school. They developed all of that. By 1910, Bernard is working in the States. And they are very anti-British, even though they grew up in Birmingham, because of what happens to the family in Mayo a generation before. So you do see that kind of those class distinctions, the kind of, you people like Mother Jones, I forget the man's name in Belfast, who was in San Francisco. And again, he was organizing the dockers there. So you get kind of union activity going on. The other thing I would say about the literacy is that Kirby keeps, where there are kind of spelling mistakes, you do see levels of literacy, different levels of literacy. So say amongst the labourers and amongst, we'll call them the servant girls, the single girls that come over from the West, come over from the South, kind of into Boston, into New York, writing home. There are huge levels of homesickness. Their spelling isn't great, their writing structure isn't great, but the emotion comes through, and I think the ideas come through very strongly in those. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a job of work again by a researcher to be done there on levels of literacy, how that reflected in that. Now, the other thing I would say, a different collection we have is the O'Murrochú collection, the Antahar O'Murrochú collection. So that's where Father Murphy was in Philadelphia collecting poems, songs, prayers from Irish immigrants, all in Irish. And again, so you do get that kind of collecting going on in the States as well, where particularly like an oral tradition that's being written down, being sent back to Douglas Hyde, being sent back to the Gaelic League as well. So there are a lot of things going on, and Kirby's collection does reflect that as far as it goes. But of course, there is a whole area of, what were levels of literacy like? How does that get captured in the collection? And how do we, I suppose, measure that? Is a very interesting question.
I think it's great that Kirby preserved the mistakes, the spelling mistakes in the originals. That will be very revealing. I know of somebody who worked on a project of Danish soldiers' letters from the 1860s and was able to actually reproduce the spoken language from the way that they were spelling the words. So, it goes beyond the written text, actually maybe, contribute to that as well. And presumably one could also detect changes in linguistic style over time to see to what extent people's English has become Americanized as a result of exposure to the States. So lots of interesting things there. Would Brandon or Dan like to add anything else to that before we wrap up? We're getting close to 5:15.
One small little point just on the letters, that the earlier letters were longer, as Kieran pointed out. The later letters tended to be somewhat shorter. And that relates to changes in the cost of postage inter alia, as well as a class dimension. No, I've little to add, except I think it's important to keep in sight that we estimate something in the region of, I think it's 1,400 discrete collections, perhaps. Some of those collections comprise a single letter, some comprise several hundred letters. The total figure of how many letters have been transcribed, we will be able to establish soon enough. But what we will be dealing with is a resource of considerable power for history. There's currently a project in, I think it's Cornell, to make available via database adverts for runaway slaves. They have something in the region of 30,000, if I remember correctly, 30,000 adverts. I think that's it. I could be wrong. But they'd have generally, maybe they have 10, but they'd have generally 2 or 3 names in them. But if you get a letter will have multiple names in it. And the power of what this will have for genealogy, family history, local history, all forms of history is immense. And it's getting it digitized, getting it accessible online. People around the world will be able to use it. And all the interesting questions that we'd like to answer, people can go at them then.
Thanks, Breandáin. Dan?
Yeah, just a quick thing. There was a question, I think, or a comment from Patrick O'Sullivan about the original documents and what you can say about things based on the paper that they're written on and so on. Those are material traces that are not available to us with Kirby's methodology, which was to make a photocopy and return the originals to those who have donated them to him. I mean, we certainly appreciate that. That's obviously for archival research rather than something one can.
The Schreier materials, Dan.
Yeah, exactly. So there are the Arnold Schreier materials, which do include, this is a distinguished fellow historian who long dead at this point, but who provided his materials to Kirby to include, in fact, in the larger collection. So there's some original materials there. And we may find that in process of time that we receive donations. That would be the larger aspiration, without wishing to impose that requirement on John Cox and colleagues. But we certainly anticipate, and Brendan's already mentioned, that there was a lot of interest that was generated by the publicity last year. So I think there's potential for that, certainly, and we look forward to that, shall we say.
And to reiterate, the old lady who sent Kirby some letters which he photocopied, and that she sent those letters to him due to an advert in the Donegal Democrat, which is not obscure, and he returned that to the old lady. When the old lady died, that could have been the first, that package of letters could have been the first thing that hit the trash can. Okay, so a lot of these materials may no longer exist, those that were collected from private individuals. A lot of those may no longer exist, except the photocopy and transcriptions made under the aegis of Kirby.
So I think this is a good point at which to acknowledge again the generosity and then the great efforts made by Kirby Miller to really preserve the archive of Irish America. And I suppose in turn the generosity of NUI Galway in trying to make this available to the world, presuming that it has the funding to do all the hard work of cataloguing and creating the database and so forth. And just to check again on the timeline, I think we were saying March 2023, is that right? So this time next year we would have some insight into what's in there.
Kieran Hoare promised me today that.
No, don't record that.
Yes, it's Patrick's Day.
Yeah, that's
it's very specific deadline for it.
I asked a very direct question and I received a direct answer. We hope, Roisin. We hope
that's her aspiration. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, well, on that note, we will finish this panel. So many thanks to our three panelists, both for today and for the longer term work that they put into putting this collection together, which I think you'll agree is going to be a phenomenal resource for researchers into Ireland and America and the transatlantic link. So thanks to Breandáin, Dan and Kieran, and I'll hand back to Barry.
Thanks,
Roisin.
And I think my first task is to make sure the library subscription to the Farmers Journal is up to date and a full collection of that. My absolute thanks to all panelists, Breandáin, Kieran, Dan and Roisin for chairing a really fascinating and richly detailed panel. A very few quick words to wrap up before we finish today's session. I mean, from both panels today, so much detail, so much innovative work going on by all contributors, and there's ever many overlapping themes coming through. I mean, from all speakers, there is an active process of recovery, I think, of the historic experiences, the networks, the circulation of ideas, of communication, that can be, if it can be picked out in two aspects, and maybe in the hope for trying to shape today's event, to come back to those two aspects, being the sources and the voices. I think we've heard from everyone so eloquently today and so detailed today of the work going on in diasporic histories, that there still needs to be continuation of the diversification of backgrounds of those material, of the work ongoing, of the archives being collected from a whole range of disciplinary backgrounds and perspectives. To be conscious of things like language, class, race, gender, representation and culture, literacy levels, as coming out in all panels recently today. So again, to come away with maybe a takeaway message, again, to continue to always assess what sources are being preserved, what sources are being made accessible, and then perhaps most crucially, whose voices are being heard at all. So a very final act is just to pass on some thank yous, and very, very necessary thank yous to many behind the scenes and all this. Most of all to our speakers, so generous with their insights and their time in many time zones today, I must add. To our chair, Roisin Healy, to John Cox, a university librarian here at NUI Galway, to library colleagues in library marketing, in particular Dwayne Burke and Evelyn Bowen. And as ever in supporting this event, the wonderful partners and co-hosts of the Moore Institute, from Director Dan Carey, Martha Shockmassey, and a special thanks to David Kelly and Matthew Geraghty for running all the tech and all the online behind the scenes work that goes invisible and making events like this happen. So my particular thanks to you all. So I think that does wrap up today's events. And again, I can only reiterate my sincere thanks to everyone who's been part of today. Again, my thanks to everyone, and goodbye. And we'll catch up again, hopefully in person as well as the virtual work. See you soon.